And we are streaming. Hey, everybody. For those of you who are listening via podcast, here's how this is going. I am reporting on the daily news from the communist perspective over on YouTube. You can easily find me at thecanadiancommie.com. That'll direct you right to the YouTube channel. When I'm speaking to people, it's speaking to commentators who comment on the YouTube channel. If you'd like to comment, if you'd like to come in, if you'd like to share something, if you'd like to tell your story, if you'd like to just hear me read something, honestly, you come on in, thecanadiancommie.com. We'll have a discussion. I answer questions. We can have a discourse. We can just stand in solidarity. If you just want to cry, honestly, given the apocalypse that we are all facing. I am here to document and discuss and help people through the decline of Western civilization and are hurtling towards this very obvious climate change apocalypse that we are doing nothing to prevent, and to try to give people an alternative narrative from the one that is being perpetrated by the extraordinarily fraudulent and incredulous power system. If you would like to donate to this project, head on over to patreon.com/thecanadiancommie. Even $1 helps, gets you into my Discord, where you can continue the process of documenting and seeing this whole catastrophe unfold. Welcome. Thank you for being here. God bless each and every one of you. Already, Exhale. Good to see you, homie. Good to see you too, Exhale. And Peanut Butter Beatrice, a pleasure every time. Well, howdy there. Oh, it is also worth pointing out, if you are hearing any kind of disruption in the background, it is because, A, I have a fan running, because there is a heat wave going on. Heat wave! Do-do-do-do-do-do. Heat wave! Do-do-do-do-do-do. And also, I have a little pug, and my little pug is a little scamp. And he does all kinds of puggy things. So every so often I might need to address him. Because he'll do things like wander into the wires of my computer. And he'll do things like beg for treats and love and cuddles, as we all do. Rusty Shackelford, hope all is well. Yeah, all is well with me, my friend. With the exception of the collapse of the capitalist system and the ecosystem. The standard stuff. Normal. Our normal civilization that constantly does normal things. Eggs D, a pleasure every time. 07 to you, my friend. So, let's just immediately pop into, I've already referred to it several times, this is from Slate. The climate is the economy. You guys aware of the climate change catastrophe that we're all facing together? Yeah, Conton, good to see you. Let's go, let's all doom scroll and go. Well, my hope is that us all coming together and having discussions about it and learning more about it will help us discover how to stop doom scrolling and start bringing that doom to the power structure. Because Lord knows we're not going to elect our way out of this problem. Yeah, Eggs D writes, my nose is sweating constantly because of this weather. I hate this. Yeah. Peanut Butter Beatrice. Long-standing joke here on the Canadian Commie. Yep, and I may have plastic in my lady balls, but shit happens. Yeah, if you're confused by that comment, please go ahead and Google plastic found in testicles. You're going to find, did you know you have microplastics in your testicles? What a functioning society that's definitely working. XAL writes, did you see Joe Biden said something about Tibet but mentioned it's in the best interest of U.S. citizens? Yeah, what a joke. What a joke. Yeah, it's definitely in the best interest of U.S. citizens to cause problems for Tibet. Yeah, definitely. From Slate, the climate is the economy. Intensifying hurricanes, floods, and heat waves are wreaking havoc across the country and on all of our bank accounts. I've been seeing articles like this pop up more and more, where the power structure is finally, discussing the climate change issue in a way that the capitalist religious acolytes, the death cultists, might actually care about, which is their pocketbook. Wait a minute. Climate change is going to murder millions of people and destroy tons and tons of assets, but it's also going to mean I lose money? The only thing that matters to a human being in all of human history? Money? The only reason why anybody ever did anything throughout all of human history? Money? Wow. Maybe I'll start to care about it. What the truth is that they are not going to start caring about it. They're just going to try to find ways to vulture the system to extract as much money as they can out of it before systemic ecosystem collapse. If you're one of the millions of Americans worried about your pocketbooks and the general cost of living, you might have picked up on some good news recently. Inflation has really been cooling off this summer, as long, sticky, and long-lamented food and energy prices continue to moderate. I love it. They talk about this as if it's like a natural force, as if it's just like, oh, well, inflation tripled, but prices tripled, but, now they're moderating. Certainly isn't boycotts. Certainly isn't people pointing out, you guys are just price gouging us. We should arrest these people for this. We should arrest journalists who talk about inflation in this way. Corporations tripled prices because they could. Nobody stopped them. Finally, the populace got together and said, we're no longer buying from you. We're no longer going to your organizations or institutions. And all the corporations went, I guess we'll just lower prices again. Like we always could have, always, 100% of the time. Because the inflation was actually price gouging and we should be arrested for it. So journalists reporting on this phenomenon in any other way other than what I just stated is journalistic malpractice, which is the reason my channel exists, because there is no such thing as journalism anymore. If you're getting your news from any Main Street outlet, it's just propaganda for corporate psychopaths. Some economic indicators remain stubborn, however, and they aren't likely to abate any time in the near future. No matter how long the Federal Reserve keeps interest rates high, what tweaks President Joe Biden makes to his trade policy, whether corporations decide themselves to slash prices on certain products, and whether COVID battery supply chains finally get some long-needed fixes. Other, grimmer recent headlines help to explain why. Hard rains from a tropical disruption in the Gulf have been battering Florida's southern region for days, leading to a rare flash flood emergency. Another batch of storms is swirling near Texas at the moment and could form into a tropical depression, according to forecasts from the National Hurricane Center. Even if both states end up missing bigger storms now, it's likely only a matter of time before they're threatened again. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration predicts that the United States will see its worst hurricane season in decades this summer. Get ready, Florida. Get ready. It's only a matter of time before Miami's underwater, right? Couldn't happen to a better province. Sorry, couldn't happen to a better state. I'm a Canadian. We don't do states, we do provinces here in Canada. Where things make sense. Meanwhile, the heat waves that have enveloped Phoenix are intensifying to the point that some analysts are deeming its latest conditions a Hurricane Katrina of heat. Spanning outward, the Midwest and Northeast are projected to get their own extreme heat warnings as early as next week, with energy demand set to skyrocket as people turn on their air conditioners. I'm sure capitalism will respond to that rationally. I'm sure they won't triple prices and be like, oh man, well everybody's making so much money right now. Supply, demand, supply, demand, supply, demand. Nationalize these places. The country has already seen $11 billion disasters this year, including the tornadoes that slammed Iowa just weeks ago. Meanwhile, the already strapped FEMA faces a budgetary crisis, and sales of catastrophe bonds are at an all-time high. Don't you love it? They made something called catastrophe bonds. Capitalism definitely works. Now, let's look back at the inflation readings. One of the categories remaining stubbornly high while other indicators shrink: shelter and housing. Natch, as rents and insurance stay hot, its still elevated interest rates make construction and mortgage costs even more prohibitive. On the energy front, motor fuel may be cheapening, but fuel and electricity for home use are still pricey. Auto insurance remains a driving outlier, as noted back in April, not least because of insurers hiking premiums for cars in especially disaster-vulnerable regions like the South, the Southwest, and the coasts. Just wait until insurance stops being a thing. Just wait until insurance stops being a thing. Wait until the insurers just pull the plug and just say we cannot insure any longer. The whole system of capital is going to come unscrewed then, right? Nothing's going to be insurable because everything's going to be destroyed. And the insurers will just lose money. Look at what else is happening on those very regions when it comes to home insurance. Providers are either retreating from or dramatically heightening their prices in states like California, Texas, Florida, and New Jersey, thanks to their unique susceptibility to climate change. These states have been supercharged extreme weather events like floods, rain bombs, heat waves, and droughts. Rain bombs! I like that. Rain bombs. What a great... leave it to Americans, eh? How can we make the word bomb fit? Bomb. Bomb them with rain. National lawmakers fear that the insurance crisis there may ultimately wreak havoc on the broader real estate sector. But that's not the only worst-case scenario they have to worry about. Agricultural yields for important commodities produced in those states, fruits, nuts, corn, sugar, veggies, and wheat, are withering thanks to punishing heat and soil nutrition depletion. The supply chains through which these products usually travel are thrown off course at varying points by storms that disrupt land and sea transportation. Preparation for these varying externalities requires supply chain middlemen and product sellers to anticipate consequential cost increases down the line and implement them sooner than later in order to cover their margins. Don't you love how they call all of this externalities? Yeah, all of these disasters that we ourselves are creating due to our burning of fossil fuels, externality, we don't consider them. We don't consider any of this in our computations, right? We don't care. It doesn't matter, right? Yeah, exactly, Joe. It's a Chinese hoax. It's just a Chinese hoax. Yeah, the Chinese made up climate change in order to sell catastrophe bonds. That's what they're doing. You may have noticed some clear standouts among the contributors to May's inflation. Juices and frozen drinks up 19.5%, along with sugar and related substitutes 6.4%. It's probably not a coincidence that Florida, a significant producer of both oranges and sugar, has seen extensive damage to those exports thanks to extreme weather patterns caused by climate change, as well as invasive crop diseases. Economists expect that orange juice prices will stay elevated during this hot, rainy summer. Incidentally, climate effects may also be influencing the current trajectory and spread of bird flu across American livestock, and you already know what that means for meat and milk prices. It goes beyond groceries, though. It applies to every basic building block of modern life: labor, immigration, travel, and materials for home building, transportation, power generation, and necessary appliances. Climate effects have been disrupting and raising the prices of timber, copper, and rubber. Even chocolate prices were skyrocketing not long ago, thanks to climate change impacts on African cocoa bean crops. The outdoor workers supplying such necessities are experiencing adverse health impacts from the brutal weather and the recent record-breaking influxes of immigrants from vulnerable countries, which, overall, have been good for the U.S. economy, are in part a response to climate change in their home nations. The climate price hikes show up in other ways as well. There's a lot of housing near the coasts. In the Gulf regions and Northeast specifically, Americans love their beaches and their big houses. Turns out, even with generous, very generous, monetary backstops from the federal government, it's expensive to build such elaborate manors and keep having to rebuild them when increasingly intense and frequent storms hit, which is why private insurers don't want to keep having to deal with that anymore. But the costs are handed off to taxpayers. This system's for sure working, eh? Right? What a great system that's for sure working. Yeah, if externalities were accounted for, no company would be profitable. Yeah, exactly. XD says, do you think they'll try to make it illegal to grow your own food? I mean, they already make land so prohibitive to own, right? Where are you growing this food? Eric, you know what? You're right, Eric. You're both wrong. It's the Jewish space lasers. That's what we really need to be concerned about. When all the economic indicators that take highest priority in Americans' heads are in such volatile motion thanks to climate change, it may be time to reconsider how traditional economics work and how we perceive their effects. It is no longer a time when extreme weather was rarer and more predictable. Its force and reasoning aren't beyond our capacity to aptly monitor, but they're certainly more difficult to track. You can't stretch out the easiest economic model to fix that, and you can't keep ignoring the clear links between our current weather hellscape, climate change, and our everyday goods. Thankfully, some actors are finally, belatedly, taking a new approach. The reinsurance company Swiss Re has acknowledged that its industry fails to aptly factor disaster and climate risks into its calculations. What? And is working to overhaul its equations. Advances in artificial intelligence, energy-intensive though they may be, are helping to improve extreme weather predictions and risk forecasts. I love it. This is what I love about how dumb we are, right? We're all sitting here being like, don't worry about it. We'll just solve the problem with new technology. That's what we'll do. We'll invent some kind of technology. Well, no, we won't. Like, no, we won't. We're not going to do that. That's not a real thing that we're actually going to do. And the people who are professing this religious ideology, which is not much different than Jesus Christ will come back to save us, never actually give you an assessment of how that would actually be reasonably done, because it isn't serious. It's literally a religious ideology. It's just people standing up and saying, Christ will return. The rapture is upon us. It's no different, right? And the proof's in the pudding. Every single time one of these technologies gets invented, it takes more resources to actually implement the technology, and it pollutes more to actually get the technology out there than it solves the pollution problem. And all of this to prevent us from just looking at one another and being like, you know, I know that when I'm polluting somewhere, the best way to stop polluting is to just stop polluting. You know, like if I was punching a guy in the face and I was told, you got to stop punching that guy in the face, and I said, I know what I'll do. I'll create a technology that will offset the punching of this guy in the face. I think everybody would go, no, dude, the best way to stop punching a guy in the face is to stop punching the guy in the face. Like, we are confronting a very serious religious ideology that is definitely baked into the brains of millions and millions and millions of people. And we have to confront that and have to take that seriously, because it's turned itself into a death cult. It's really obvious. At the state level, insurers are pushing back against local policies that bafflingly forbid them from pricing climate risks into their models. And Florida has new legislation requiring more transparency in the housing market around regional flooding histories. New York legislators are attempting to ban insurers from backstopping the very fossil fuel industry that's contributed to so much of their ongoing crisis. After all, we're no longer in a world where climate change affects the economy, or where voters prioritizing economic or inflationary concerns are responding to something distinct from climate change. We're in a world where climate change is the economy. Yeah, see, for us Marxists, we've always understood that the actual economy isn't money, right? If you're a religious acolyte of capital, right, if you're one of the death cultists, then the only thing that matters is money. I read articles over and over and over and over and over and over again on this channel that essentially treat money as the only reason why anybody would do anything. Like literally, China's building so many solar panels, it's going to make people not be able to make so much money. Forget about the solar panels. Money is what matters. If we produce too much milk, then milk will essentially be free and nobody can make any money. Like, it's one of these things where money is worshipped. We worship money, right? We're worshiping money. We're sacrificing everything at the altar of it. Meanwhile, Marxists are sitting there being like, the economy is actually assets and the ability to produce goods. Like, that's the actual economy, right? The financial sector, the tool by which we organize those things is not itself the economy. So the American conception of economics is just collapsing on its face, right? Just collapsing on its face completely. Never forget, brother, your comments are like kind of veiled. I don't know how to respond to them. Like, so I hope you're doing well out there, my man. Like, I could feel the sort of lingering frustration. Long defiance, social status at all costs. Good to see you, by the way. Eric writes, oh, before I forget again, since now I am more financially stable, I was able to give you a subscription now on Patreon. Continue doing your great work, my friend. Thank you, Eric. I appreciate that, my man. Big shout out to all of my Patreons. I don't feel comfortable. Oh, Azeron, good to see you. I don't feel comfortable naming names. I've often thought about that. Is there something extra that I can do for my Patreons? Is there something more that I could do for the people who are donating to my Patreon? And I don't want to do individual shout-outs. If you're going to do shout-outs in the chat, I'm not going to stop you. But I don't want to name names, and I think that should be for obvious reasons, given what it is we're doing here and what the plan is and what it is we're trying to support. But all of that said, you guys know who you are. Thank you so much for donating. Thank you so much for being part of the Patreon. Thank you for supporting me. If you would like to increase your donation from $1 to $2 to $3 to $4 to $5, please go to patreon.com/thecanadiancommie. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everybody. Joe writes, will the majority ever connect the dots and realize we need to jettison this profit above all nonsense? Anytime I speak to anybody who is actually in the political apparatus, and I know people in the political apparatus, they tell me that it's going to take a crisis. It's going to take something actually serious to knock people out of their torpor and knock people out of their stasis in order to actually get to a point where they are seriously willing to move forward. Like, we all know that we need to nationalize things. We all know that nationalization is the solution to a lot of the problems. We all know that we have to do it. Right? Why are we not doing it? Because we don't really want to confront capital. We don't really want to have the fight. We don't want to hear them cry and whine and moan and bitch. We don't want to put up with the lawsuits. We don't want to have to put up with the legislative concerns. We don't want to have to fight the fight. Right? That's what it is. Liberals and conservatives especially are just not interested in fighting the fight. They don't want to do it. It's just easier for them to pocket the payout that they get from the corporate state and pass legislation that their corporate buddies want them to pass and then go work for their corporate buddies when they're out of office. Right? It's just easier. And it's not going to be until there's actually a serious, genuine crisis that the power structure is even going to begin the contemplation seriously of actually doing anything about it. But in the case of climate change, by the time that actually occurs, it could be too late. It'd be like trying to shore up a building after it's already started to collapse. And so, like, it's a sad situation that we find ourselves in. It's a sad situation that we find ourselves in, especially as the country seems to be pivoting further and further to the far right. Speaking of, XD asks, and what kind of people oppose us? From The Intercept, utterly dismayed, Air Force engineer resigns as dissent against Gaza war slowly spreads within the military. Little bit of good news. I don't want to be working on something that can turn around and be used to slaughter innocent people. Got to get out of the military then, my man. That's literally the only reason the American military exists at all, is to slaughter innocent people, to steal and extract resources. That's the purpose of the United States military. It doesn't exist for any other reason. 16 years ago, Riley Livermore enlisted in the Air Force. His path to the military was shaped by his evangelical Christian upbringing and growing up amid the War on Terror. His ensuing career as a flight test engineer took him to Israel, where he spent 2 years doing missile guidance research. And shortly after October 7th, he decided he couldn't continue anymore. Livermore is utterly dismayed by how President Joe Biden and the Department of Defense has been complicit in the genocide in Gaza, he told The Intercept, so much so that he is in the final steps of separating from the Air Force, a months-long process he initiated in late October. Once he officially exits the military, he said, he will never again work in what he describes as the military-industrial complex. Even phrases like this, in what he describes as the military-industrial complex. You mean the military-industrial complex that 100% exists? Like, come on, why are we pretending anymore? Like, why are we pretending that the United States has not been taken over by a military-industrial complex that's obviously running the place? Like, what are you talking about? I don't want to be working on something that can turn around and be used to slaughter innocent people, he said. I think the dissonance just kind of continued to get louder and louder. It's like, I can't really do this anymore. Livermore joins a burgeoning wave of dissent within the Biden administration and the military over U.S. support for Israel's war on Gaza, including 9 prominent resignations in recent months. 25-year-old Airman Aaron Bushnell's self-immolation in February, and a new service member-led campaign to help soldiers speak out against elected officials' support for the Israeli war. To call it a war is so embarrassing. Like, it's just so embarrassing. I've got like a little tidbit of information right here, yeah. From the Spectator Index, breaking, UN Relief and Works Agency officials says 65,000 people remain in Rafah, down from 1.4 million 6 weeks ago. Oh, wow, what do you think happened? That's a war, all right. Yeah, we're definitely fighting a war, right? Where, you know, the classic war where one side just carpet bombs another side while they do nothing. While we actually say out loud to that group, hey, go over here to be safe. It's a refugee camp. You'll be totally safe in Rafah. You'll be completely safe. We won't do anything to Rafah. Everything will be fine. It's a refugee camp. Escape to Rafah, everybody. Flee to Rafah, and then they just carpet bomb Rafah. Like, it's a genocide. Call it a genocide. Regain your intellectual and moral credibility, mainstream media. Come on, The Intercept. Start reporting credibly, right? The reason why I exist as an entity at all is because you're not doing your job. Very straightforwardly, and it's obvious and see-through, and people understand it. It's the reason why people come in here, so that they can hear somebody actually tell the truth about what's going on in the world and point out that that's not a war. That's a genocide, and it's nothing else. The latter campaign comes in the wake of Jewish Major Harrison Mann's public resignation from the United States Army, in protest of America's nearly unqualified support of the government of Israel, which has enabled and empowered the killing and starvation of tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians. In the weeks since Mann's resignation, The Intercept has heard from members of the armed forces who expressed emotions ranging from guilt and frustration to outrage and repudiation regarding the Biden administration's unconditional support for Israel, which includes billions of dollars in military aid, as well as political and diplomatic cover. The testimonies, while limited in scope, nevertheless signal dissent within American power structures bubbling beyond the public resignations and protests seen thus far. The Department of Defense declined to comment. Every single one of my friends in the military agree that this is a genocide, one 7-year member of the Army wrote in a message. We're all outraged by the repeated war crimes and depravity of Israel, as well as America's complicity and enabling. An airman's evolution. Livermore first commissioned with the Air Force in 2012, and after graduating with a master's degree from the Air Force Institute of Technology 2 years later, he was selected to go to Israel for an engineering sciences exchange program. During his 2 years there, Livermore researched missile guidance algorithms while learning Hebrew, immersing himself in the culture and making friends. Israel had kind of a special place in my heart, he said. Ironically, Livermore's open-armed experience in Israel is what helped lead him to his belief today that the United States government may be complicit in supporting an Israeli genocide against Palestinians. The first seed was planted by a Palestinian friend in the Air Force, who pulled him aside before he departed for Israel. The friend warned him of possibly being met with a lopsided story about Israel and Palestine, Livermore recalled. He said his friend introduced him to the Israel lobby, like the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, and its influence on United States politics. He also recalled his friend advising him simply to note where people start the story when they talk about the country's history. Do they acknowledge the historic Palestine? Or is their starting point the Balfour Declaration, or the creation of the State of Israel in 1948? Come on, we all know when history started, everybody. We all know when history started. It was October 7th. History started on October 7th and not a day earlier. I'm so grateful for that because it kind of helped me maybe inculcate a little bit from what I see now is like heavily Zionist propaganda, and it always didn't sit well with me in general. Just some of the Zionist talking points as far as like we're a nation surrounded by enemies, but yet we're the strongest around, Livermore said. There's also this sense of being an American, being in the American military. It's like America owes Israel something. There's lots of things, dynamics I didn't super like. You mean like the fascism? Like the overt, naked fascism? The fact that Israel is obviously a fascist state and that Zionism is the same as Nazism? I don't super like that either. In language classes he took before his deployment and in interactions with people from around the world upon arriving, he added his conversation with peers began to challenge his pre-existing assumptions. We're the good guys. They're the bad guys. We're protecting interests abroad. We're the fighters for democracy. Like, it kind of put a lot of cracks in that, Livermore said. Yeah, a genocide will do that, right? We're the good guys. That's why we murdered 1 million people for nothing. Livermore's experience in Israel also challenged his faith. He grew up evangelical Christian and was active in his church, where he met his wife. In Israel, he joined what's called a Messianic congregation, a self-proclaimed Jewish sect that embraces evangelical Christianity. Having grown up as a Christian nationalist, he began to see self-avowedly moral and pro-life people setting those values aside for the sake of their political interests, which intersected with Israeli policy aims, pointing to widespread support for President Donald Trump, moving of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem as an example. He saw his faith being used as a cudgel for capitalism and power and oppressing people, while maintaining a strong connection to a Jesus who preached love today. He added, he doesn't believe in white Jesus anymore, the Jesus wrapped in an American flag with an M4. Livermore slowly grew disenchanted with the military, especially as he reflected more on how the United States waged war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've had friends who died, he said. It's like, what's this all for? Then came October 7th, the beginning of history. His exposure to Israeli military brass during his training, as well as the rhetoric he had heard from Israeli friends in October, primed him for how ugly things could get. I knew just how bad it was going to be and how there would be wholesale acceptance from the Israeli population, Livermore said, offering demolish Gaza, wipe it off the face of the earth, as an example of the types of comments he heard. Before October 7th, Livermore said he would have been a little more of an Israeli apologist, or like it's complicated, kind of a take both sides type approach. Israel's war on Gaza, however, was a pry bar that kind of ripped it wide open. Livermore's work in the Air Force has mainly focused on research and development, he said. Though he's worked with several contractors he reckons had more of a direct link with operations in Gaza. He said that learning more about Israel's use of targeting systems like Gospel and Lavender, artificial intelligence systems that have mechanized Israel's war on Gaza, with little oversight, scared him. He credits his wife for helping him cut through the bullshit and not simply put his head down without engaging with the moral stakes. It's not an easy process to leave, Livermore noted. The joke is the only harder thing than getting into the military is getting out of it. He said it's typically a multi-month ordeal, including congressionally mandated training and bureaucratic exit processing. There are also varied contingencies and approval processes based on how long members have served. In his case, the process he commenced last year will be finalized later this summer. Not only do I want to get out of active duty, but I want nothing to do with anything that's directly like the military-industrial complex, he said. It's not worth the money. Breaking points. For Livermore, Mann's resignation letter was extremely relatable. The Jewish Army major described the anticipation of waiting for things to improve or to end, only for them not to. It was a similar feeling that bolstered Livermore's resolve to act on his pre-existing inclinations to leave the Air Force. Nemesis Hazem, who serves as a doctor in the U.S. Army, also found Mann's decision a source of comfort, as she's grappled with her role in the military. I wish I could just quit, but at least this is validating and makes me feel like I'm not the only one feeling completely out of place, Hazem wrote to The Intercept. She said she enlisted to help pay for medical school and has rationalized her way through because of it. But it gets harder and harder, she said, adding that she'll fulfill her time obligations in November 2025. I feel useless. Ideally, I would get out now and volunteer in Gaza, but I don't have that option until they no longer own me. One 22-year member of the Air Force who comes from a lineage of service members described to The Intercept his evolution from committed foot soldier to today fearing that the U.S. is enabling a genocide. In the wake of Bushnell's self-immolation, he appealed to the higher-ups to lead conversations around mental health in Gaza. Those efforts didn't go anywhere, but he himself broached the subject of Bushnell with his unit to indicate it was safe to talk about the war on Gaza. After Mann resigned, the Air Force member wrote a letter to a senior officer that invoked some of Mann's own words, and once again requested internal conversations to help people cope with the war. At some point, whatever the justification, we're either advancing a policy that enables the mass killing and starvation of innocent people and children, or we're not, he wrote. We're either advancing the destruction of schools, hospitals, and life-supporting infrastructure of 2 million people, or we're not. In a message to The Intercept, he wrote that he condemns Hamas's attacks on Israel as well as any and all anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. At the same time, he continued, I also condemn what I feel is not a proportional response by Israel as it related to international law of armed conflict. I also feel like our country and leaders are enabling what seems to be genocide. It's remarkable turnaround for someone who enthusiastically enlisted in the wake of 9/11. I remember feeling proud that I would be able to join the armed forces to help rid the world of terrorism. He recalled the hype videos that were part of training in the academy. We would see videos of jets flying at high speed, dropping bombs, tank firing munitions, etc., while bombs over Baghdad by Outcast or Bodies Let the Bodies Hit the Floor by Drowning Pool played. Yeah, the best way to rid the world of terrorism is to never join the United States military. The United States military is obviously the largest terror organization that exists on the planet. The second largest is obviously the CIA. These terrorist organizations, don't go near them. Don't join them. Don't join the American police forces. These are terrorist organizations, and it's very, very obvious to everyone except the people who are joining the military, apparently. Reflecting on the academy atmosphere now, he said, whether intentional or not, it was indeed preparing us to potentially do harm to others, but also to desensitize us to that fact as well. His time as an intelligence analyst in Afghanistan, where he said he observed military abuses of ordinary Afghans, contributed to his eventual disillusionment with the United States military. Still, he's decided to remain enlisted in hopes of encouraging younger soldiers to view things more critically, even as America's relentless support for Israel's campaign against Gaza makes it increasingly difficult. The 7-year member of the Army who expressed outrage at the war enlisted at the age of 21, they said, because they had just become homeless, had to drop out of college, and didn't know where else to go. The military changed their life for the better, they said. So now you're starting to understand why America keeps everybody homeless and in poverty, right? Make it so that the military is the only option you have. The greatest country in the world. But the war on Gaza has taken its toll. I've been at the edge of my limits pretty much since the conflict started, they said, and the recent U.S.-supported Israeli operation to rescue 4 Israeli hostages that killed at least 274 Palestinians and injured hundreds of others felt like a breaking point, one that feels too little, too late, but better late than never, I guess. They are experiencing tangible mental health consequences as a result of watching a genocide in real time, while simultaneously wearing a uniform that represents it, they said. Consequently, they plan to exit when their contract is up next year and also stay away from any Department of Defense-related work. I would do 20 years if our country didn't use the armed forces to commit war crimes and violate international law at every step, they wrote. It feels like every conflict we participate in or facilitate is fucking sinister and evil. Yeah, that would be because it is fucking sinister and evil, right? It doesn't feel that way. It is that way. Like, when you put your hand in a fire, it doesn't feel hot. It is hot. Organized resistance. Earlier this month, a coalition of veterans and anti-war organizations launched a campaign to help people in the military who are similarly struggling with U.S. support for Israel's continued war on the people of Palestine, to advocate against it. The campaign, led by Veterans for Peace, the Center on Conscience and War, About Face, Veterans Against the War, and the Military Law Task Force of the National Lawyers Guild, provides people in active duty, the National Guard, and the reserves with guidance and legal advice on how to raise concerns about the war with elected officials. The groups have prepared templates that service members can use to reach out to elected officials. We are not mere pawns in a political game. We are human beings with the capacity for empathy, compassion, and moral discernment. It is time for us to reclaim our humanity and refuse to be complicit in the genocide of an entire people, one template reads. As of Monday, about 30 service members had engaged with the process, according to Mike Ferner, Special Forces Manager at Veterans for Peace. The Appeal for Redress version 2 effort is inspired by a campaign of the same name that took place in 2006 and 7. That campaign, the groups say, led to nearly 3,000 armed service members sending protected communications to their congressional representatives calling for an end to the wars and occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Former Ohio Representative Dennis Kucinich helped deliver over 1,000 signatures to Congress on a statement that carried the calls. Senior Airman Larry Hebert, who is seeking conscientious objector status, told The Intercept he views the new effort as baseline action that every service member should take part in. This is your constitutional right, and I advise everyone to exercise that right, he said. Whether you like to believe it or not, the Department of Defense supports the missions that kills innocent Palestinians. We cannot just ignore this fact. Leave the military. If you're part of the military, leave. Get out of it. Don't join the military. If somebody from the military approaches you, tell them to fuck off and call them a genocider. Very straightforward. These people are monsters. Anybody who's part of the military and isn't actively seeking to leave the military is complicit in a genocide. I don't actually care that you feel bad about it. Leave. Leave. Get out. It's the only way for you to regain your morality, to be taken seriously as a moral person. Leave. Get out. As fast as you possibly can. Like, your country is actively committing a genocide and is going to continue acting that way. This is Nazi shit. That's what we're looking at. This is Nazi shit. And it's not going to end. It's not going to stop. Unless you make it stop. Long Defiant writes, you should become a disciple of Rathbone. Yeah, I like Rathbone. He's trying to survive over on TikTok. I've seen him evolve into doing satirical work because it's more difficult for them to go after him. For those of you who don't know, Rathbone is a fellow over on TikTok who I advise everybody follow if you're on TikTok. He does really good work, and he makes things very concise, straightforward. His method is suited to the TikTok format. It's quite impressive. I'm always impressed to see that he's not getting banned off TikTok. I know that he got suspended fairly recently, but he remains a figure. I mean, I get banned off TikTok, so I don't know how he's managing it. Joe writes, people say it's just a few bad apples with the police, not any inherent institutional flaw. I tell them how the police came into existence. They don't care. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I've been saying over and over again, and I just find myself saying more and more, is that America deserves this coming collapse. Like, sorry. Like, I'm sorry that it's going to spread misery and hardship across the country. I'm sorry that you're going to see people plunge into poverty. Like, I'm sorry that all of that is happening. But America deserves it. Like, 100%. It's well earned. You did it. Congratulations. Peanut Butter Beatrice says, we solve all our problems with violence. I think that's part of the reason why there are so many mass shootings in the U.S. Yep. U.S. military service is not honorable. That guy, good to see you. I hope you're surviving in the heat, John. Yeah, I am. I got a fan on me right now. It's tough. Joe writes, straight up fascist policy, my fellow citizens. Vote for that. Never again. Long Defiant writes, of Rathbone. He's on YouTube. You and he have similarities. One of the things that I've really come to learn doing this work, Long Defiant, is that leftists are fairly skeptical of one another. It seems like you really got to know somebody who knows somebody. Like, I can't just cold call Rathbone, right? He'll ignore it. And I've seen that over and over again. It's just nobody really, like, take somebody like Eddie, Midwestern Marks, right? He wants to exist in the bubble that he has. He doesn't want another leftist to come in and he doesn't want to talk to another leftist. Like, he's fine talking to, like, libertarians and other people. But I've really seen this as, like, something of a strange flaw in leftist movements, that even the big guys, like, people don't really want to get together and they don't want to talk, right? Oh yeah, Eric is referring to the from the International. Long Defiance says, I'm talking about style. Most of the listeners want you to publish clips. Yeah, I definitely have to do that. I definitely have to do that. You're right. You're right. No, it's true. I have to, like, part of the issue that I have doing this work is that it takes a lot of energy for me. And it's, for me to do this live stream and then to also, like, do the clips and to also put things together and then also spread it around and then also do all that kind of stuff. I'm just one person. And I'm also working another job on top of that. Like, I'm just one person. I'm trying my best. And I do want to do clips and I do want to do that kind of stuff. And thank you all for being patient for me while I move forward with this format. And I know that you guys are rooting for me and I know you will want to see me grow. But I'm just one guy. Like, I don't have anybody else over here except my little pug. So, when people say to me, John, you should do clips, it's like, okay, cool, right? Like, I'll sift through a 3-hour show every night, find the clip, work on that clip, right? So, yeah, I agree. If I had the energy of 2 people, sure. Like, if I had 3 people back here working on this project, sure. But so, like, reality meets the road at some point, and I have to actually, like, not go crazy on this end, right? So thank you for your encouragement, but there is, like, a real thing going on this side. From the International, Freedom and poverty in Argentina. Millei's 100 frenetic days in power and an unprecedented economic experiment. The ultra-neoliberal policies of the new president threaten to dynamite the already weak foundations of the welfare state in the South American country. Javier Milei, I don't know how to pronounce his name actually. Javier Milei. Like, what a clown this guy is. Straight up, like, the picture they've chosen to use is like some like demented, something from a like Scorsese movie, or like oh, come on. It doesn't matter. Javier Milei came to power last December in an Argentina worn down by successive crises, with the promise of ending the slow decline of the South American country and turning it into a world power yet again. The president announced that he was going to deregulate all sectors of the economy, privatize public companies, lower taxes, and replace the peso with the dollar, and shutter the central bank. This proposal involves dynamiting the foundations of the bruised Argentinian welfare state and replacing it with an economic system that has few regulations and much more market freedom. In the 3 months since he became president, Milei has carried out a draconian fiscal adjustment. He has begun to liberalize the economy via executive decree, implementing more than 300 measures. The rental market is now fully in the hands of the landlords. There are no more controls imposed by the government. Private healthcare companies can set the price they wish for their clients, while several industrial and commercial regulations have been repealed. A first step has also been taken towards the privatization of state-owned companies. Millei's economic policies have pulled the Argentinian people one step backwards from where they were before he assumed office. Inflation now exceeds that of Venezuela and is the highest in the world, 276% year over year, while the poverty rate is closing in on 60%. Unemployment is also on the rise. Milei blames the deterioration of the economy on his predecessors, and it's maintaining a fixed course towards an irreversible transformation. Along the way, he has encountered two obstacles: the National Congress, which has prevented him from gutting the state apparatus, and the justice system, which has put his labor reforms made via executive decree on hold. If anyone thought that so many decades of cheap and impoverishing populism could be resolved in 90 days, they were wrong, presidential spokesman Manuel Adorni said on Thursday, March 14th. Our success is that expectations have changed. The population is beginning to understand that we've avoided the worst, and what we've avoided, hyperinflation, and that we're going through difficult months, by virtue of correcting a lot of inequalities and distortions, he added. Adorni refrained from predicting when the economic recovery will actually begin. Discontent is rocking the streets, which calls for strikes and protests every week. But the president refuses to look for another course of action, and is betting that his opponents will eventually step aside and give him a clear path to impose his agenda. So far, his dogmatic character has prevailed over the pragmatism expected of a head of state who has a weak legislative minority. In the National Congress, his far-right La Libertad Avanza, Liberty Advances coalition, only has 38 of 257 deputies and 7 of 72 senators. The Argentine president, a 53-year-old economist and TV panelist by profession, defines himself as a libertarian, a fascist. He is a fellow of the Austrian school, a school of thought founded by Karl Menger at the end of the 19th century, which places individual freedom as the basis of progress and maintains that the state should stay away from the economic decisions of individuals. The state is a criminal organization, Milei affirmed on March 1st in his opening speech to the 2024-2025 legislative session. This is the same message that made him popular as a talk show guest and on which he based his successful electoral campaign when he made the leap to politics. The difference is that since December 10th of 2023, Milei is the leading representative of the very institutions he's attacking. A radical doctrine. The president admires the economist Murray Rothbard of the Austrian school, to the point of naming one of his 4 dogs after him. The term anarcho-capitalism, fascism, is attributed to Rothbard, who defended the total abolition of the state in favor of individual sovereignty. Milley considers himself to be an anarcho-capitalist at heart, but a minarchist in practice. That is, he believes the state functions should be limited to justice and security. This explains why some time ago he was in favor of the sale of organs and even the sale of children, with no restrictions on personal firearms. He dropped these ideas in the final months of the presidential campaign. Yeah, who knew that selling children was going to be unpopular? Milley's doctrine is radical for any country. I'm the first libertarian president in the world, he likes to boast, but much more so in Argentina, where the state is one of the largest employers, and the economy receives massive public investment. The resounding victory of a candidate who brandished a chainsaw as a symbol of cutting public spending was possible due to widespread fatigue with the traditional political class, after 12 years of economic stagnation and Argentines' loss of purchasing power. The purchasing power of salaries was reduced by 25% between December of 2017 and November of 2023. There's no money, Milley lamented in his first speech as president, and no one came out to contradict him. He then announced a fiscal adjustment plan consisting of spending cuts equivalent to 5% of GDP over the course of 2024. The first cut was symbolic. The number of ministries shrank from 19 to 9. He then ordered the freezing of almost all public works and devalued the peso by 54% to bring the value of the official price, regulated by the state, closer to that of the black market. The gap between the two, which was greater than 100%, is now around 20%. The measure was applauded by the markets and the export sector, Argentina's economic engine, but it contributes to the prices of goods and services soaring, with incomes unable to keep up. In the first 2 months of Milley's administration, salaries lost 23% purchasing power, almost the same as in the previous 6 years combined. And the forecasts aren't encouraging either. GDP fell by 1.6% in 2023, while a decline of 2.8% is expected this year. The adjustment has included a 64% reduction in the multi-billion-dollar subsidies with which the previous center-left governments kept public transportation and various utilities, such as electricity, gas, and water, at relatively low prices. The value of bus tickets in Buenos Aires has multiplied by 5 since Milley assumed the presidency, up to the current 270 pesos, about about 30 cents. It's a very low price compared to other countries in the region, but it represents a new blow to the depleted pockets of Argentinians, especially for workers who make more than 1 trip a day. Electricity, gas, and water bills have also become more expensive and will continue to rise. This is a disaster, dude. Like, what I'm reading here right now is like a country that's just imploding. Straight up, like, who knew that giving all the power to a group of psychopaths was going to have negative consequences? Runaway inflation has been used by the new government to meet its objectives. Milley's administration has frozen many social benefits in order to obtain large budgetary savings. This has particularly affected retired Argentines. The minimum pension is now 134,000 pesos, about $130 a month. A figure that is below the poverty line, which is 193,000 pesos for an adult, $185. More and more elderly Argentines cannot afford medications, which have increased in price by more than 300% over the past year. Who knew that privatizing medicine would have an effect like that? Milley is governing for the market and turning his back on society, warns economist Juan Manuel Telechia. Argentinian bonds are rising. The country's risk rating has dropped to its lowest level in 9 months, while the central bank has already accumulated more than $9 billion in reserves. Argentinian registered a fiscal surplus in January for the first time since 2012, but according to Talachia, this positive data has created a false sense of success. This expert believes that it's unsustainable. How much more are we going to be able to cut social programs and pensions? And hides the fact that a great social crisis is brewing beneath the surface. The middle class is dealing with declining incomes by reducing all possible expenses, as shown by the collapse in consumption. This past February, according to local chambers of commerce, sales in small and medium-sized businesses fell 25%, while the number of new car license plates fell by 20%, according to the Argentine Dealers Association. Families who still cannot make ends meet have begun to exchange the US dollar they've saved up. Almost everybody comes to sell dollars. Nobody buys, says owners of new currency trading businesses in the center of Buenos Aires. The exchange rate at which these transactions are made isn't the official one, less than 900 pesos per dollar, but rather the market rate. 1 unit of the U.S. currency was sold in the middle of last week at around 1,085 pesos and was bought at 1,035. The situation is critical for the poorest citizens. Although Argentina is one of the largest food exporters in the world, among its 46 million inhabitants, there are almost 5 million who suffer from hunger. The income of 1 in every 10 households is insufficient to purchase essential groceries, which have become 300% more expensive in the last year, with a cost similar to that of Spain, a high-income country. The price of some basic products such as milk is even higher. A liter of whole milk from a supermarket chain costs about $1.30, more expensive than in many European countries. Salaries, on the other hand, are much lower. The monthly minimum wage in Argentina is the equivalent of around $215 a month. Jesus fucking Christ. In 2024, attendance at free community kitchens has reached levels similar to those recorded during the peak of the pandemic in 2020. These meal providers cannot cope. Milei has suspended the delivery of supplies and has ordered a review of this social assistance model. These kitchens are currently dependent on donations and support from municipal and provincial governments. The president attributes the social emergency to past policies. The last 20 years have been an economic disaster, an orgy of public spending, uncontrolled spending that has resulted in the worst inheritance that any government in Argentine history has ever received, he told legislators earlier this month. For economic historian Pablo Gurchanov, Milei wants to return to the conservative bonanza of 1910, a utopian desire. He compares this to the rise of the populist Peronist model in the 1940s, which saw the government of President Juan Perón greatly increase the role of the state in the economy. Two anarchisms in competition, Gurchachev recently wrote in an opinion column. Since Argentina's return to democracy in 1983, there has been one president who has escaped Milei's wrath, Carlos Menem, who governed from 1989 until 1999. Argentina suffered from hyperinflation at the beginning of his administration, but he later stabilized prices with the convertibility law, which pegged the value of the peso to that of the dollar. He removed restrictions on imports and privatized almost all public companies, including the state oil company YPF. The convertibility model began to break down in 1994, but was maintained until 2001, when it blew up amidst the worst economic and social crisis in the country's recent history. To get out of that crisis, Argentina benefited from high international grain prices. That tailwind has ceased, but there's still good news for Milei. The country has recovered from last year's historic drought. It's expected that grain exports will bring in at least $15 billion more this year than 2023. Milei's administration will also benefit from the production of fossil fuels from the Vaca Muerta oil field, which is expected to contribute to an energy trade surplus of $3 billion in 2024. Milei wants to go further than Menem. He has promised to adopt the US dollar as the national currency. Economists of different currents consider dollarization to be a terrible idea. but the Argentine president hasn't taken it off the table. Segments of the citizenry also support the proposal. The reason that experts gave for opposing dollarization are technical, but the discussion on the street is to lower inflation, says sociologist Marina Luzzi, co-author of the book The Dollar: How the US Dollar Became a Popular Currency in Argentina. Luzzi affirms that dollarization has the halo of a magical solution for those who are tired of the peso losing value day by day. Excuse me 1 second, guys. Milo, get out of the cords, dude. What are you doing? Get out of there. Get out of there. Get out of there. My man. I don't know why Milo loves to just walk into the cords. He just loves to walk into the cords that are down there. I don't get it. He's a good boy. But, like, my man, don't walk into the cords. You're going to destroy... You're going to actually destroy my entire setup. I'm just going to jump to the end of this. It's a very long article. Look, this is straight up what we're seeing is a country that was ruled by liberals, right, and a neoliberal agenda. Right? They privatized the oil, they privatized the resource base, and what's the result of a neoliberal agenda? Right? The neoliberalism leads to what? Quote unquote libertarianism, fascism, right? And all it's going to do is accelerate the problem, right? And meanwhile, people who support Milley, and I've had people in here who have supported Milley, right, say out loud, oh, well, the guy before him was such a disaster. Yeah, the guy before him was such a disaster because he was a neoliberal, right? You guys are going from neoliberals to fascists, and we're all doing it. We're all going from neoliberals to fascists. And when somebody actually stands up and says, hey, you know what we should do instead? We should maybe follow the socialist line, right? Maybe we should actually take a look at countries that have enacted like socialist policies and see how they've done. What do we get told? Oh, communism fails every time it's been tried, which is why we've got to bomb it. Okay. It's just like I'm just at a point where it's like we kind of deserve it. Like we're definitely in a place where, like, boy howdy, are we just like setting ourselves up to careen into total disaster? That we're doing everything we can to ensure that our society declines as swiftly as possible. And then when the society begins its swift descent, we hand the reins over to people who say we need to destroy it faster. Like, it's just wild, wild, wild to see. Long Defiant, if you want to do it, do it. Real straightforward. Yeah, who's supporting this tool? Milley, yeah. Does he have a lot of citizen support? No, he ends up with about like 30% support, which is how it usually goes for fascists. Gabriel says, don't be fooled. He still wants to do that, yeah. That guy says, okay, you say that America deserves it, and Canada too. I get it, I hear you. But do they? Do we? You said that before, that in the Imperial Core, we're the most propagandized people in the world. What I find so strange. Now, let me just finish your comments. That guy continues. We're embracing populism and fascism and licking the boot. Liberalism is the default and it's the end of history. But do we deserve it? Can the people be blamed? It's been fed to us. We haven't really done this to ourselves. This has systemically been done to us. Canada doesn't deserve Poilievre. America doesn't deserve Trump. So they've been delivered. So here's where I kind of cross the threshold, okay? Any person should be smart enough to know. Any person should be able to figure out that once you realize that the system is lying to you, once you see that the system is designed to lie to you, that it's going to continue lying to you. But what I see, and what I think many of us have seen, is a desire in the working class to maintain the ideology of the people, the very people who have been lying to us. Like, it should no longer be at all controversial to stand up and say we need to do some communism up in here. That should be a completely non-controversial statement, right? But the work that I have been doing and the work that I will continue to do shows me very clearly that the populace will happily elect fascists instead of even tinkering or dealing with the idea of, hey, maybe the enemies of capitalism, we should listen to them. Maybe the ideological enemy of capitalism we should actually pay attention to. Maybe we should actually do something about these issues and expect something to be done, right? That, and don't get me wrong, like, it's going to be horrific, and it's going to be brutal, and it's going to be hard to watch, and it's going to be hard to experience. Like, I'm not going to pull back on any of that, but there are solutions, and there are things that we can do, and we're just not interested. Like, that's really what it comes down to. We're just not interested. Over on Twitch, James Clown 22. What if more art? I don't know what you're saying, dude. Good to see you, though. Glad you're here. That guy writes, I agree with you, Joe. Willful ignorance is a problem, because Joe says willfully ignorant. I feel like that's also programmed. But this is what I'm saying, is that, like, if everybody is walking around saying, well, the only way anything will change is through a crisis, and that's what everybody is saying, the only way anything will change is through a crisis, well, then guess what? We earn that crisis, right? We're not trying to step ahead of the crisis. We're not trying to say, okay, a crisis is coming, let's get ahead of that crisis. We're not trying to say, what solutions can we put in place to mitigate the crisis? We're all acknowledging that a crisis is coming, right? And what am I hearing? Well, nothing will change until the crisis comes. Okay, then we deserve the crisis. Like, and I understand that that's hard to hear. Like, I get that. So what? Like, if Canada and the United States wanted to actually mitigate these crises, they would. And there are those of us who are arguing in favor of that. And who are saying out loud in front of everybody, we should do something about this. We should organize. We should get with people. We should abandon these parties. We should stop voting for liberals and conservatives. We should stop voting for Democrats and Republicans. We should start taking over local political apparatus. We've got to actually do something about this. No, we're going to wait for the crisis. Okay. James Clown 22. Oh, okay, so what if majority disagree? Disagree with what, James? What's the tipping point for you? For what? Like, can you just clarify your position? I'm not exactly sure what it is you're talking about. I appreciate that you're here, though. Yep. It is like challenging deeply held religious beliefs. That is what it is, right? Yeah, Milia's going to destroy his country thinking he's saving it. Yeah. Peanut Butter Beatrice. Yeah, who bears the greater... Okay, so now we're getting into a real interesting... We are getting into an interesting conversation, and that guy has brought up an interesting thought and an interesting idea. Yeah, who bears the greater blame? The con men or their marks? I find that to be a tough call sometimes. Well, I mean, I think whoever has the most power, right? Whoever has the most power, that the power of the working class is their ability to withhold labor. That's really what it is. And we're seeing a movement, actually, that is moving us towards that direction, right? I've got an article here from Business Insider. Gen Z and millennial NEETs are on the rise. Many say they'd rather do nothing than be unhappy at work. Youth unemployment around the world is rising to levels not seen in decades. According to the International Labor Organization in 2023, around a fifth, 21.7% of people between 15 and 24 years old, were considered NEETs worldwide. The acronym stands for people who are not in education, employment, or training. Many NEETs are listless, struggling through tough economic times, living off loans, and losing hope of retirement or buying a house. But not all of them are pessimistic about the future. Some young people reject the idea that being a NEET is a bad thing and want to reclaim the label by creating a subculture of the voluntarily dormant. Rather than jump on the first opportunities that come along, voluntary NEETs are holding back and hoping to witness an evolving workplace culture that they'll enter when it suits them better. This is the crisis that we're talking about. The system isn't going to just reform itself. Voluntarily idle. Some Gen Zers struggle to find a job or stay in work or education, earning the nickname disconnected youth. One Gallup survey found that Gen Zers are increasingly anxious about their education or career paths. Another study by the St. Louis Federal Reserve's Institute for Economic Equity found that a third of young Americans aged between 18 and 24 have no income. Millennials are in a similar boat, being labeled the lost generation and being first in the firing line when companies go through layoffs or axe middle management positions. But some Zoomer and Millennial NEETs are happy to wait out unemployment for the right career path. Note how this article is being framed. It's all just being framed along the way of like, soon they'll be back in the capitalist system. Soon the capitalist system will be back. Morgan Pitcher, for example, recently shared why he is happy to be voluntarily idle on TikTok. Pitcher, who was born in 1994 and lives in Vancouver, has been unemployed since the start of the COVID pandemic when he got sick. He believes being a NEET by choice is breaking one of the most accepted social norms we have today. Pitcher told Business Insider his experience being a NEET has been revealing. He worked in the automotive industry before COVID-19, but then became very ill and was in hospital for weeks. When he recovered, he wasn't able to go back to his previous job, he said. It reveals how much shame in guilt is built into our everyday lives, Pitcher told Business Insider of being a NEET. People are not happy for you. They actually despise you, seeing you as lazy and unmotivated and dependent on the charity of others. Pitcher was making a good salary when he was employed, but he was miserable the whole time, he said in his TikTok. So despite the struggles, he'd rather wait it out and find a job that matters to him than pick the first thing that comes along. Rejecting hustle culture. Several NEETs recently spoke to Vice. Many lived at home or had some inheritance or savings they could live off for the time being. Some said they basically do nothing all day except work on themselves through yoga, hobbies, creative projects, and seeing friends. Imagine describing a life where people are exercising, growing themselves, increasing their own intellectual and spiritual capacity, improving themselves, doing the things that they love to do, spending time with friends and family, and describing that as doing nothing all day. Like, what's the point of a society? What's the point of being alive? Are we really here just to work for capitalists and then die? Is that really what we're here to achieve? In all these jobs, I wasn't treated well as a person, and they weren't fulfilling either, said 22-year-old Liani. I felt like a puppet, always having to do what I was told without being able to make decisions. Another NEET, Lucas, 21, said he started an apprenticeship in a car manufacturer's warehouse when he graduated high school, but quit because it was so terrible. I wasn't treated like a human being there, more like a tool that could be easily replaced, he said. While career experts agree being unemployed for too long can negatively impact someone's trajectory and make them unmarketable, there are benefits to being more selective and patient in a job search, because it's all about the job search, right? That's what it is. It's all about being a job. It's all about becoming useful to capitalists and nothing else. right? It's not about actually growing and having a good society. It's not about having people who are enriching their lives and learning and reading and improving themselves. It's not about having a culture, right? It's not about any of that. It's about, well, you'll find out which slot you fit in. You'll become a cog at some point, right? Eventually, all of these cogs will line up, and we'll put them into the machine, and then the capital machine will run. Like, it just constantly circles back around to that. Constantly circling roundabout to that. James Watts, a career coach and the founder of the community platform Teach.io, told Business Insider that a corporate culture that prioritizes profits over employee well-being is a turnoff to young people. I would argue that it's a turnoff for everybody. It's just that, people have been beaten into submission. He said Gen Zers and young millennials favor organizations with ethical values, a commitment to diversity, and a transparent culture. They have witnessed the burnout that hustle culture can cause and aspire to something different. The NEAT mindset highlights how young people today are looking for work that truly inspires and fulfills them, not just jobs that pay the bills, Watts said. It's a wake-up call for workplaces to change. Laurie Cure, who has a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology and is the CEO of management consulting firm Innovative Connections, told Business Insider that people who entered the workforce during a period of economic instability after the Great Recession and COVID lockdown years bore witness to many lows and very few highs. They are living in a time when wealth is concentrated, home ownership feels out of reach, and rental prices and the cost of living are skyrocketing, she said. For generations that are already contending with mounting debts, side hustles can be more appealing than a traditional career path. Darian Muriner, the CEO and co-founder of the team coaching platform Cloverleaf, told Business Insider that the NEAT label is not a retreat from work, but perhaps a call for meaningful and fulfilling employment. Perhaps it's only articulating the demand for purposeful work that aligns with individual strengths and passions, he said. It's not about avoiding work, it's about finding work that lights a person up. The long-term impact may be that more people are in the right positions. When people are engaged in work that truly matters to them, they are more productive, innovative, and committed, Muriner said. Pitcher's family doesn't understand his decision to be a NEAT by choice, but he's found security and support with his friends, who have given him places to stay. This gives him faith that things will be okay, he told Business Insider. I just stopped caring about finances and stopped worrying, he said. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the best thing I've ever done. What really resonates there for me is perhaps it's only articulating the demand for purposeful work that aligns with individual strengths and passions. Hello, hi. That's essentially what this is all about, what you're watching. You're watching me do exactly that. Like, I'm not going to participate in the system of capital simply for the sake of accumulating money, while most systems are tied to slavery and genocide. Right? 0% of that happening. Not interested. Not interested in going to work for some psychopath. Not interested in working for some thief who's actively stealing from us. Which is essentially all of them, as far as I'm concerned. Like, they are going to have to convince me, because near as I can see, the proof is in the pudding at this point. Right? The proof is in the pudding at this point. The capitalist system has failed. It cannot recover. It will not recover. And if any employer wants me to go work for them, they will have to make the case to me. I am not interviewing for them. They are interviewing for me, as far as I am concerned. Corporate culture is a failure. It should be completely eliminated. Corporations should be nationalized. The whole system should collapse. That's my starting position. And until I see that, not interested. Buy Amazon. Buy Walmart. Get the fuck out of here. James Clown 22 writes on Twitch, what is the tipping point for you for a large political change? Would reducing government power over people be a fairer solution? I'm not sure. I think individuals should vote in a communist idea. So, James, you're new here, so you've never actually heard me speak about this. I'm very much a realist. I take a very realistic approach to how this is actually going to unfold and how this is actually going to change and how things are actually going to move forward, right? I do not think that electoralism will be a solution. What we will actually see, and the most likely thing for us to see, is that Western society is going to go into a significant decline, a significant tailspin, akin to the Great Depression, although we're already, by many measurements, in the Great Depression today. That tailspin is going to continue downwards until it becomes completely undeniable for everybody. And it appears that the political apparatus is not going to respond rationally. Moreover, we are actually facing something much, 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 much scarier than the Great Depression, which is that the political and wealthy elite in the society have abandoned the society and have every inclination to continue abandoning the society. They're essentially moving forward with a project of wealth extraction followed by abandonment. How this is going to go is that the federated systems that exist, so the federal government, is going to lose its administrative credibility. This isn't going to happen tomorrow, okay? This isn't going to happen right now. But this is the trajectory of how empires die, and that is what we are watching. We're watching an empire begin to die. The federal government is going to lose its credibility and lose its ability to govern, and states and provinces throughout North America will begin to break off and declare their independence. That is how all empires move forward. That is how all empires fracture and break up. And that is what we are witnessing. I know that when I say these things, people kind of get into a scoffing sort of pattern. But as recently as in the 1990s, Quebec was electing. Quebec went through a referendum for separation. Texas literally has a secessionist government in power right now. Greg Abbott wrote a letter saying that the pact between the states and the federal government has been broken. It is likely that within our lifetimes, I cannot peg a date, of course, but within our lifetimes, we will see sections of the American empire begin to break off. That the United States of America will no longer become united. What this means for people who are trying to organize and who are trying to right the ship, so to speak, is that we need to focus locally. We need to focus locally. That the weakness of this podcast, and I acknowledge this completely, is that we are well too spread out. That there's not nearly enough of us in a concentrated area to make an impact. That my role in this is to raise consciousness, raise awareness, and hopefully encourage people to begin the process of organizing locally. I organize with communist organizations in my neighborhood. I advise you find your communist organization, or at least an organization that is explicitly anti-capitalist. We are not going to move forward successfully with capitalist ideas. We are not going to move forward successfully with reformation policies, because the collapse is going to be faster than the reformations. And so that is our objective, and that's what we need to be looking at doing. I hope that answers your question, right? I hope that touches down on something and encourages you to think about the issue in a different way. Because I feel like there is a false hope that exists within the zeitgeist and the consciousness of humanity today. And that false hope is that we are going to vote our way out of this. That is not a solution. That is not an option. We exist within a structure that non-Marxists have described as inverted totalitarianist, but what Marxists would describe as the dictatorship of capital. which is to say that the only people that the electoral system will ever permit to be in the electoral system at all will be capitalists. And the best you will ever get from a capitalist is some small piecemeal reformism. But now the situation has actually gotten so dire and so desperate that the capitalists will simply uproot themselves and abandon us. They've made that excessively clear to us. That they are not going to reinvest in the society. They will simply go off to Jeffrey Epstein's pedophile island, or Mark Zuckerberg's underground bunker, or Snailbrook, or go to the top of a mountain, or some ridiculous nonsense thing that they have planned for themselves. And they will simply abandon us. And so we need to be acting in that way. We need to be acting as though we have already been abandoned. That if we were somehow able to seize power in a significant way and begin the process of actually following policies that would actually be of benefit to the populace, the capitalists would literally fund Hitler-level fascists in order to round us up and send us to concentration camps, the way they did before. Right? Which, incidentally, that's coming, whether you like it or not. So, there's no escape hatch. Kill the little hope inside your heart that says we can vote our way out of it, and that there's an escape hatch. Because there is no escape hatch. The people who live in your building, the people who live beside you, literally beside you, those are the people who you need to be talking to. You need to be organizing with the people in your neighborhood. You need to be knocking on people's doors. You need to have little pamphlets. You need to be organizing with those people. You need to organize with your workplaces. You need to organize into unions. You need to organize stable structures within your communities. You need to literally be building community where you stand and where you are. Because when these collapses come, and these collapses are coming, that's all you're going to have. That's all you're going to have. So start now. Start now. James continues, thank you for your answer. Well, thank you for your kindness, James. I want a fairer system, but it's a moral question. I am torn with the moral part of communism. So communists argue that communism is not about morality. It is not it is a social science. I'm gonna mangle this quote a little bit. I think Engels, one of the founders of the modern communist movement, Engels said that communism is the study of the liberation of the proletariat. That's what communism actually is. It's how do we move the society forward in order to liberate the working class and liberate the what's called the proletariat, and it's not about morality. That the people who try to bring morality into the conversations are the religious acolytes, the religious death cultists, the capitalists, who have turned capitalism into a religious ideology that they enforce through their god, which they call money. And I am also optimistic for humanity, but I think it's important that we also be realistic about what actually happens to societies who walk down this path, right? That we have been for a long time an empire, and empires collapse. And people have studied the phenomenon of empire collapse. We know what happens. We know what happens. It's not about morality. It's not about right or wrong. We know what happens when empires collapse. We've watched the Indian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Ottoman Empire. We've watched the Roman Empire, the multiple Chinese empires that have risen and fallen and risen and fallen, the British Empire, right? The Mongolian Empire, the Grecian Empire under Alexander the Great, And now we have the American empire, and it's collapsing. And we know it's collapsing. It is falling apart, and we know exactly what happens when empires fall apart, right? That the territories that they have gone abroad start to split off and declare their independence, just how India declared its independence from Britain, right? And then eventually the internal systems, like America is an extremely huge piece of territory. It is a massively enormous piece of territory. And when you actually look at the history of America, it is essentially just a vomiting out of capitalism that wipes out a people while enslaving another continent of people, that just spews across America and then erects itself as an institution. Well, it's not going to stabilize. It's going to fall. It's going to go like this. And when it does, sections of it are going to break apart. I take a look at Texas. I take a look at California. Those are the two big ones that I take a look at. The South will rise again, without a doubt. And sections of America will turn to what they'll call social democracy. Sections of America will become explicitly fascist. Sections of America will become communist. That and those ideological differences and those differences of position will create different societies and different structures and different ideas as America begins to reconfigure itself into a series of separate countries. That's the outcome for America. The idea that America is going to stabilize itself and remain the United States of America in perpetuity forever and all time is ahistorical to the highest possible degree. There isn't a single scrap of evidence that should convince you that America remains stable and in this position. That the history of humanity shows us very clearly that organizations that spring up exactly in the manner that America did die. And that's what we're witnessing. We're witnessing a dying empire. So get to know your friends. Get to know your neighbors. Get to know the people around you. And take those relationships very seriously. James writes, they can, but can communist empires also collapse? So you could make the argument that the Soviet Union collapsed, right? I would make the argument that the Soviet Union didn't collapse. It was dissolved for intrinsic reasons and different reasons. There has yet to be a communist empire, right? That, of course, bad faith actors and people who are not rooting for communist societies to work would describe the Soviet Union as a empire. I would not. There have been people as well who are trying to convince themselves that what modern day China is doing is an empire. I again would refute that and say, no, that's not the case. That what communism is doing is anti-empire. Yeah, June's kind of hitting it here. Imperialism is not when big country does did thing to small country, right? That imperialism and empire is a specific configuration. It's highly militaristic. It involves going abroad and creating colonies, using those colonies as extracting points and bringing wealth back in to the motherland, back in to the center of the empire, the heart of the empire. And eventually this system decays and collapses. That the people who are actually doing the work of empire, the soldiers, right? They stop doing it because they begin to see that what they're doing is actually harmful, that it's not actually helping anybody, that it's causing a lot of problems, because it is causing a lot of problems. And it's this lack of loyalty or lack of commitment to the idea of the empire over the long term, generation over generation, that ideas pass down through time, through generations, by generation by generation. There's a baton that gets passed from one generation to the next. And empire is one of those ideas that cannot pass from one generation to the next. That when a generation gets swept up in the spirit of empire, it defines that generation. But then one of the defining characteristics of generations that precede it is the desire to get away from that empire. And it collapses over time because the empire is seen as harmful. You generally create an upper class. In the modern sense, it's the capitalist class, right? A bourgeois class who do no work, provide no value to anyone, and yet own all of the property for no reason that anyone can decipher. The illegitimacy of which becomes more and more apparent as the baton passes from generation to generation. This conception that exists within the mind of the capitalist class that I earned it, I'm a capitalist and I earned my wealth, breaks apart when you have people like Galen Weston Jr. inheriting multi-billion-dollar corporations and then jacking prices on everybody. We're essentially running under a principle of divine right at this point. And to pretend otherwise is sort of a wacky thing to do. It's so inherently flawed. And the inherent contradictions that lay within empire and capitalism begin to break the project apart because these contradictions cannot be upheld. Specifically, the contradictions that exist between the working class and the bourgeois class. Meanwhile, communist societies seek to smooth out and eliminate these contradictions. And it's the smoothing out and the elimination of these contradictions that lead to sustainability in the long term. That your empire ceases to be an empire and instead you're left not with a nation, but a civilization. And that is a distinct and different idea. Something that we here in the West, because we're such a new country and such a new nation and such a new idea, and we don't actually have a culture and we don't actually have ideologies that are rooted in anything serious, we don't understand what a civilization is. We literally cannot comprehend that concept and that idea. And so when we see other countries beginning to enter this civilizational status, we don't know what we're looking at. And so we make the mistake and say, well, they're an empire too, because that's what we are. And we're the only thing that we think matters. And we can't possibly imagine an alternative system that could be even equal to our system, because our system is based completely on the concept of supremacy. So the whole thing is falling apart, and it's falling apart in front of our eyes. So again, I loop back around. Get with your friends, get with your family, get with your neighbors. Start reading Engels, start reading Marx, start learning about what it is to be part of the working class, and stop venerating these capitalists. Stop pretending like these capitalists have value or worth. They are universally harmful. They do nothing important whatsoever. I actually have like a really... yeah, here it is. I found someone recently. Every single time I find another one of these Western capitalists who is a Nazi sympathizer or a Nazi supporter, I want to bring it forward. Charles Eugene Badeau. Badeau was friends with British royalty and Nazis alike. He was born 1886. He died 1944. He was the fifth wealthiest man in the United States. Nobody knows about him. Badeau was one of the leading contributors in the field of work measurement or labor measurement, one aspect of the scientific management movement. In this, he was strongly influenced by F.W. Taylor's book Shop Management, particularly Taylor's time study practices, and Charles E. Knopel's writing on the industrial layout and routing. Building on their work, he introduced the concept of rating assessments, which led to improvements in the compatibility of employee and departmental efficiency. He named this the Badeau system of human power measurement. This, of course, led to a series of strikes, labor resistance. Yeah, Badeau, Britain had several labor issues. There was a strike over the system at the Rover plant in Coventry. Essentially, the automatization of humanity, turning people into just automatons, where they have to follow a schedule. And then, of course, he ends up in December 1942, shortly after the Allied military landings in North Africa in Operation Torch. Bedeau was in Algeria promoting the construction of water and peanut oil pipelines between West Africa and the Mediterranean coast. He and his son were arrested by the French on behalf of the OSS and transferred to the Americans. He was kept in custody without charge for a year. He was eventually flown to the U.S. awaiting charges with trading with the enemy and treason. And he killed himself by taking an overdose of barbiturates in FBI custody. The wealthy class in America is oftentimes tied to Nazis and Nazism. This guy was a Nazi collaborator. He worked with Nazis like Henry Ford. Only this guy was actually arrested. James continues, "My moral compass is to try to have as much freedom as possible without imposing on others. If you have one life, I guess more choice is best." So, James, that's like the fundamental beginning of libertarian thought, right? Or there's nothing wrong with that idea in principle. Maximize the freedom of others, right? My advice to you is to begin taking more seriously the understanding that there are systems at play in the society, that we have systems and there are systemic truths and systemic realities. The reason why libertarianism as a conception in America fails is because it fails to account for what happens to free market systems if left unregulated. Free market systems, left unregulated, devolve into monopolies. That is how they work intrinsically. I've often been quoted as saying, I don't buy into libertarianism because I don't think an ideology that's disproven by a single board game has much credibility. Play one game of the game Monopoly and actually take it seriously. Actually look at what you're doing. Actually understand what you're doing when you're playing that game. And understand that this is what happens in unregulated free trade markets. One person eventually has all of the money, all of the property, all of the wealth, and everybody else has nothing. That is what happens. And when you enter that kind of situation, you return and regress your society back to a feudal structure, which could be argued that this is what we are in today, that we are existing in a feudal structure today. That, of course, happens because of the inherent contradictions that exist within the system of capital. James Clown says Nazi sounds a little harsh. What's the connection? So, James, I'm going to give you a much clearer connection, right? You know who Henry Ford is, right? We're all familiar with Henry Ford, right? Of Ford, right? The car company. Okay? So Henry Ford, he was responsible for providing the Nazis and the Nazi war machine with their engines. If it hadn't been for Henry Ford and his productive capacity building engines for the Nazis, they wouldn't have had tanks. They wouldn't have had jeeps. They wouldn't have had the war machine that they had if not for Henry Ford. Henry Ford was awarded the Iron Cross from the Nazis for his service. The Iron Cross is the highest honor that the Nazis can bestow upon a civilian. The idea that America was ever against Nazism is a silly idea. The Nazis built their policies in regards to how to treat the Jews around American segregation policies. In fact, the Nazis said outright that the segregationist policies of the Americas were too harsh. James says, you said the systems lead to a Nazi concept. I agree there are bad actors. No. It's worse than simply bad actors. Right? It's not merely individualism. Right? It's not that an individual individualizes their individualism, and that's the individualist's individualism, right? That this hyper focus on the individual is part of the capitalist death cult. That they never want you to pay any attention to the systems that are in play and the results of those systems. And the outcomes of those systems. So I'll give you a fairly clear example of what I mean by paying attention to systems. Every single time we have studied what wealth does to the psychology of a person, every single time any institution anywhere has looked into what does wealth do to the heart or the soul or the mind of an individual, what we come up with is that the more wealth you accrue, the more likely it is you are going to actually become a psychopath. That you lose your ability to have empathy, you lose your ability to have compassion. When they do brain scans of wealthy people, they find that the frontal cortex, the place where you experience empathy, is damaged. Just as if you had something like schizophrenia or if you were a psychopath. June issues a correction. Thank you, John. June. Ford was awarded the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, not the Iron Cross. The Grand Cross of the German Eagle. Thank you so much, June, for that correction. I appreciate that. We here at the Canadian Commie believe in disseminating proper information, and when I say something incorrect, I would like to be corrected. So thank you so much. This fact alone, the fact that the more wealth you accrue, the less empathetic you become, the less capable of empathy and compassion you become, this by itself should convince us that the system of capital and the idea of wealth accumulation should be utterly destroyed, because it is systemically generating psychopaths. And it turns out that the people who are the most psychopathic in our society end up being the people who have the most amount of wealth to act upon that psychopathy. It's absolutely brutal. James writes, thank you for your detailed answers. Well, James, you've been very polite and very kind, and I thank you for that. I can't ask for anything better than that. And that is what I am here to do, James. I'm here to win hearts and minds, one person at a time if I have to. That is a good opportunity for me to say, like and share and subscribe. Please hit the bells. Please hit the whistles. If you would like to donate to this project, be sure to head over to patreon.com/thecanadiancommie. You can find it in the description. Even $1 donation helps. More importantly than any of that, of course, tell someone I exist. As simple as that. James says, I would also like to see if I'm wrong on things. Yes, of course. I think that that's an honorable pursuit. I know for myself the best thing that I ever did for my own consciousness and my own well-being as a creature in the world was to insist that my worldview must be challenged. I came up as an evangelical Christian conservative in rural Manitoba. That was my starting location. That was my random spawn-in point. I believed that Jesus Christ was coming back at any moment. I believed in the rapture. I believed that it was wrong to be homosexual. Everything that evangelical Christianity still preaches, I was upholding and I preached loudly and largely. I went to university specifically to have those worldviews challenged, and it wasn't until I graduated from university and moved to Toronto that I finally left all of that behind. That sloughing off evangelical fundamentalism is no small task, and it takes a lot of effort to do it, which is why I'm a huge proponent of post-secondary education and education in general. I don't really consider what we do in elementary school. Well, I consider what we do in elementary school to be education because of reading, writing, and math. I consider high school to be a total propaganda indoctrination session and nothing else. I think that everything that we are taught from grade 9 to grade 12 is fundamentally worthless and needs to be completely looked at and completely ripped out and torn apart. That if an education system is still graduating religious fundamentalists, it's no education system that's worth a goddamn at all. Eric writes, I had a guy recently who tried to argue that but Henry Ford traded with the USSR. Does that mean the USSR is fascist? While ignoring the entire conservative establishment fought against communism. Yeah, capitalists fund both sides. It's just how like capitalists try to take credit for the victory of World War II, and they'll say that, well, the Soviets used American steel. We traded steel with them. No, the Americans were playing both sides. That's the absolute truth. They were trying to profit from both sides of World War II. And they only got involved in World War II because the Nazis lost on the Eastern Front. And they knew that if they didn't get involved in World War II, the Soviets would take Europe. And so America gets involved in World War II to meet the Soviets at Berlin, to prevent the Soviets from moving forward into France, Spain, and Portugal, and maybe even Britain, and taking all of Europe and turning those countries into communist countries under the Soviet Union. Like, America has never been the good guys at no point in their history. Yeah, Eric writes, and at every turn we even have people like Winston Churchill saying if he was Italian, he would have supported Mussolini. Yeah, I mean, Churchill is brutal. Churchill's one of the more brutal figures in British history, frankly. Like, you should listen to some of the stuff he said about the Indians. James writes, I feel you. Hell was a concept which would be punishing. Well done for breaking free. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. It's, yeah, it was it's been a long road getting from there to here. It's been a long time. But my time is finally here. Big ups to people who understand the reference. Isaac writes, we are taught to avoid capitalism? Are we? Are we taught to avoid capitalism? I feel like the strength of the capitalist system in terms of its propaganda is that it is the strongest propaganda that exists is the propaganda that you don't think is propaganda. That's the strongest form of propaganda. That if you're just walking around in your life, operating on a series of ideas and principles that are just assumed. Oh, Isaac clarifies, we are taught to obey capitalism. Yeah, that's right. Well, take a look at the structure of the education system to begin with. Like, really, I think that there is something that we all do need to contend with, and that is the mass trauma of the public indoctrination of the public school system, which is generally a mass indoctrination system to the system of capital. And the structure of the education system is exactly like this. You are put into an education system when you are too young to comprehend anything. 5 or 6 years old, and you are part of the education system. The education system justifies itself by teaching things like reading, writing, and math. Important skills, and I'll never say anything otherwise. But that's not the fundamental thing that the education system is actually teaching. That the fundamental thing that the education system is actually teaching is obedience. That the fundamental principle of the education system is do what you're told. One of the big questions that started to surface when I was in grade 10, 11, and 12, and we were learning about some random scrap of information or some random piece of history, or learning something like trigonometry, we would ask, how is this going to help me after school? All of us had already gotten quite finished with school. We'd already all concluded that school was quite tedious and annoying, and everybody hated it. And so we were looking forward to this chapter of our lives being finished and us moving on to something bigger and grander, failing to recognize, of course, that the entire system is like this. And that this process that we are going through is a process of an indoctrination into obedience. And us asking the question, how will this help us when we graduate, was fundamentally met with the response, just do what you're told. If you were a person who refused to do what you were told, and who looked at the task at hand and looked at what was going on and said, this is pointless, I'm not going to participate, well, then you were failed out of the system. Or you were given a C grade. You were pushed over to the side. You were excluded from the procedure in the system. But if you did what you were told, no matter how stupid the idea, no matter how ridiculous the concept, no matter how much of a waste of time that it actually was, well, A+. You did what you were told. And if you did what you were told very well, you would get scholarships so that you could go to university and then continue doing what you're told. And if you did what you were told very well in those universities, in that university structure, you would get hired to be the manager of big corporations where you would continue doing what you're told. So that when the moment came, when you, as the CEO of a big corporation, had to ruin 1 million people's lives, you would do it. Because you were doing what you were told. You were just following orders. James writes, Canada seems like a very fair country overall. Yeah, we do project that image. Hasn't capitalism helped lift many third world countries out of poverty? No. Which third world country? Just pick one. James writes, continues, would your arguments be more against corporatism or cronyism? These concepts of corporatism or cronyism, India is a good choice. Let's talk about India. These ideas of corporatism or cronyism were invented by capitalists in order to prevent us from actually discussing that corporatism and cronyism is capitalism. That those are not separate ideas. They are invented ideas from the capitalist class, in order to prevent us from having a serious and robust conversation about what capitalism is. That when you see corporatism or cronyism, when you say that, I say that's capitalism, baby. That it is inherent to the system of capital that the wealthy people that spring out from it will use their wealth to take over the political system. That is not something separate from capitalism. That is capitalism itself. And that is how the dictatorship of capital maintains its dictatorship status, by purchasing political power and the political apparatuses that exist. There is concern that many countries are going to fall to this dictatorship of capital, China being one that I defend on the regular. So let's pivot to India. You have said, hasn't capitalism helped lift many third world countries out of poverty, such as India? I feel the need, James, to bring up the map. You'll find that if you spend more time with me that I love going to maps. I think maps are important to look at. So, the history of capitalism in India is... Oh, this is taking a minute. I'm a bit concerned that my internet is kind of crapping out, guys. So if I drop off, that's what's going on. India used to be one of the largest economies on the planet. It represented between 20 to 25% of GDP in the world. Before capitalism ever showed up at all, India had built itself to be an economic powerhouse. It had enormous textile mills. Its textiles were renowned throughout the world and heavily sought after. The British Empire moved into India. They enslaved the population of India, famously cutting off the thumbs of the weavers so that they could not ply their trade anymore. They smashed the looms. They destroyed the textile mills. They destroyed the productive capacity of India. They took the administrators, they took the weavers, they took the dyers, they took the people whose job it was to actually work with the cotton that the Indians were growing, and they put them in the fields to grow and pick cotton amongst other commodities, and they shipped that to Britain. By the time the British are expelled from India and India declares its independence, the GDP of India has dropped from 20 to 25% of the world's GDP to 2 to 3% of the world's GDP. The United Kingdom, the British Empire, experiences a GDP growth of about 20%. So when you say, isn't capitalism responsible for lifting people out of poverty in regards to, let's say, India, my response is politely, I have no fucking idea what you're talking about. The history of capitalism in India is a history of the impoverishment of the Indian people. That is explicitly and factually the truth. And it is a total indictment of our education system that is not commonly understood and commonly known. Because our education system works to protect the system of capital from its own citizens. Since the Declaration of Independence by India, they have been trying to recover. And they have been facing, let's call it political opposition from the capitalist classes that still exist in India, the bourgeoisie of India. Because while the British left, the Indian bourgeoisie remained. And the Indian bourgeoisie operates exactly in the same way as all capitalist bourgeoisie do, which is, how can I get people to do work for nothing while I do no work whatsoever? And this internal contradiction that exists within Indian society as it exists in American society, as it exists in European society, is keeping the working class poor. This is steadily starting to shift. The reason why it is steadily starting to shift is because the communist country of China has experienced such overwhelming and obvious growth in such a swift and speedy manner that India can no longer ignore it. It shares a border with China. And many Indian citizens have begun to ask, how come we can't do that too? Why is our country stagnating? Why are we stuck in this pre-colonial mode? How come we can't advance? And you're starting to see Maoist organizations and Maoist communist organizations spring up all over India, which Modi, the current leader, is taking very seriously. James writes, I did not know that. Wow. Well, you do now, my friend. Yeah, look into the colonial period. What you're going to find, James, is that when you get into the historical analysis of most countries in the world, you will eventually, and especially when you get into like Africa, there's a moment where the history of Africa stops and colonial history begins. Africa, for example, was explicitly carved up by the European powers. The European powers literally sat down at a meeting and drew up a map of Africa and carved it up amongst themselves so that the European powers would not go to war over its colonization of Africa. That's the Spanish, the French, the Germans, the British, the Portuguese, the Italians, amongst others, the Bulgarians. And if you look at the history of Zambia, Angola, Somalia, Libya, Chad, Niger, any of them, there is a moment where, the British invaded, the French invaded, the Germans invaded, the Portuguese invaded, and that country became a colony. That's how capitalism has grown itself. That if you are living in, let's just pick New Mexico, right? If you're just living in a random place like Seattle, Washington, right? If you're just living in Seattle, Washington, and your experience of capitalism is just the experience of living in Seattle, Washington, and things seem pretty decent, right? You might be completely disconnected from the idea and the fact that the reason why your country seems to be so wealthy is because it's extracting wealth from colonies that they took over through warfare a century ago. Like, the system of colonialism has been the fuel and the fire of this capitalist enterprise. And it's based off of genocide, slavery, and war. Explicitly. There's a reason you're not taught these things. I advise finding a book called, written by Howard Zinn, called The People's History of America. Howard Zinn was a World War II pilot who, after the war, spent his life as a historian, erecting a history of the United States, not from the perspective of the leadership, but from the perspective of the people. And he talks about the First Nations people, the Latino population, the black population, and he talks about the sacrifices that those populations had to endure in order for this capitalist project to actually take hold. Bound writes on Twitch, capitalism has elevated the economies of many tourist-dependent countries like Fiji, the Bahamas, and Barbados. In these nations, which lack significant export industries, tourism serves as the primary means of generating substantial income. Again, what you're going to find is if you do a historical analysis of these countries, you are going to run face first into colonialism. That you cannot talk about Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Fiji, Barbados, the Bahamas, without also discussing the fact that these countries experienced invasion. That there's a reason why they're poor, right? Michael Parenti said something very wise once. I highly advise everybody look up the works of Michael Parenti. He said, these countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited. And that's exactly what has happened to places like Barbados, Grenada, St. Lucia, Dominica. Like, why do you think these places have Spanish names? Like, do you think that the people who lived there called it Barbados? No, they were invaded by the Spaniards. And the Spaniards extracted all the wealth that they possibly could, including slave labor, and left them with nothing. And then we turn around and say, oh, but look at its flourishing tourist industry. We've helped them. Ridiculous. James writes, I understand the flaws of capitalism. We need solid evidence of communism working better. We need solid evidence of communism working better than capitalism. I assume that's what you were writing. Autocorrect is a thing, eh? So I would like you to pursue a book called, written by Michael Parenti, called Black Shirts and Reds. Michael Parenti makes the argument that we here in the West hold on to this attitude and this idea that communism did not work. And he makes the case that communism did in fact work. That it was very successful at its stated goals. That it lifted people out of poverty. That Richard Wolff is another person to pursue for this. Richard Wolff points out, before the Soviet Union and before the Bolsheviks had the revolution in Russia, Russia was ruled by Tsars. It was a feudal monarchy where most of the people in Russia were peasants. And in the space of a single generation, the communists turned that peasant agrarian economy into one of the largest, most powerful industrial superpowers on the planet, capable of becoming the first people into space. This is the life story of a person that lived in Russia. I was born a feudal serf. I experienced the overthrow of the Tsars. I watched my farming industry become industrialized and automated. I watched my country go into space. We defeated the largest industrialized army the world had ever seen in the Nazis. Doesn't seem like a failure to me. China. China is a massively successful communist project. They currently call themselves socialist with Chinese characteristics because they use Marxism and historical analysis. They understand that they are not a communist society. They have not achieved communism. But they are pursuing the line of the liberation of the proletariat. To argue that China has not grown exponentially and has not improved the lives of the proletariat is to disengage with reality in any manner that can be called serious. That after the Revolutionary War, under Mao, the People's Republic of China comes into existence in 1949. And after fighting against imperialist wars in Korea and Vietnam, they were forced to capitulate and allow some capitalist enterprise into China. And since then, they have been managing an economic war front against imperialist powers, and they have been winning. And they are winning. And I can go into that more if you would like me to. I love talking about China. I think China's a beautiful place. The plans that America has for China, the plan alone should make you despise America. James continues. I have to say, James, I'm just going to interrupt right now. I'm really enjoying this back and forth that we've had because you're being so polite and you're being so lovely. I have to let you know. And I really, really appreciate that, James. Sometimes people come in here and they act very bullish and they act very full of themselves and very confident in their position when they have no right to have confidence in their position whatsoever. The Gaza genocide should tell them that something's gone wrong and there's something sick in their society. So I appreciate the manner by which you're handling themselves. James writes, I understand that, but wasn't there more than the Industrial Revolution? But it worked until it didn't. Russia would have excelled. Oh, your statement is Russia would have excelled if capitalism had got it first. That if the Russians had have started with capitalism, they would have done better. So what you're talking about is the dissolution of the Soviet Union, right? And that's a bit more of a tricky situation because it gets into geopolitics and it gets into the realities of ruling a nation. World War II was extremely taxing on Russia. Right? Russia lost 25 million citizens to the Nazis and the Nazi war machine. The Nazis absolutely destroyed everything they could possibly touch. Look up pictures of Stalingrad. Like, Stalingrad was absolutely reduced to rubble. Losing 25 million people in a war is not a small-scale kind of situation. And the ruling class of Russia, after Stalin, of course, moved into a policy of capitalist appeasement. That the policy is very simple. It's better to befriend capitalists and attempt to integrate ourselves into capitalist systems than it is to withstand another war. It's very important to understand that after World War II, and the rebuilding of Europe, an organization came out of Europe that still exists today called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. One of the major members of NATO in this military alliance, which they call a defensive alliance, is Germany. If we remember, Germany was the former Nazi state that invaded Russia and killed 25 million of its citizens. Germany is not only a member of NATO, but many former Nazis were within the apparatus of NATO. Look up Adolf Hausinger, and you will find that there was even a Nazi that sat as the chairman of NATO for a period of time. From the Russian position, this is extremely terrifying. And so the Russians, under Khrushchev, and then Brezhnev, and then Gorbachev, and then Yeltsin, and even Putin in the first half of his career, were moving forward with the policy of integration with the West. Get integrated into these systems, because if we are their friend, they won't invade us again. And that was the idea that they were running on until the modern period when things had to change. And I can get into that too if you would like. The so the Soviet Union didn't collapse because communism wasn't working. The Soviet Union as an idea was abandoned by the ruling class as a form of appeasement to capitalist powers who, in their path to try to avoid another mass conflagration and another mass war. It's the result of a trauma. I often say the Soviets beat the Nazis, but fascism beat communism in Russia. And I think that that's absolutely true. Oh, now James really wants to get into it. But you're being so kind about it, James, that I'll take what you're saying in good faith. We can't ignore Mao's Great Leap Forward, or the Holodomor. Let's start with Mao's Great Leap Forward, and then we'll do the Holodomor. Because you'll find that as we have this discussion, the people that are ignoring facts and evidence are in fact the capitalists. The People's Republic of China is formed in 1949. That's 3 years after World War II. You see where Japan is? Just off the coast of China, right? There's Hiroshima, right? You see where Hiroshima is? Hiroshima, China. There's Korea, right? So Hiroshima gets a nuclear bomb dropped on it. I bet you if you were to stand on the coast of Shanghai and look towards Japan, you could have seen the mushroom cloud. That happened in 1946. Okay? And this is important. It's important that you know this. Because the Great Leap Forward is often decontextualized from history and detached in order to give you war blindness and to pretend as though the Chinese were acting out of some other principle other than utter and total terror inflicted on them by the imperialist capitalist powers. So after the nuking of Japan in 1946, the end of World War II, the People's Republic of China is formed 3 years later, after fighting and winning a revolutionary war within its own borders. 1950, literally 1 year after the formation of the People's Republic of China, the Americans invade Korea. You see how North Korea shares a border with China? Well, the reason why North Korea still exists as an entity at all is because the Chinese were funneling troops and resources into Korea as the Americans invaded. This is the Korean War. As you can see, the Americans split the country of Korea into two politically. They vassalized South Korea. North Korea was reduced to rubble. 80% of the infrastructure in North Korea was destroyed, including dams, including churches, including temples, including schools. 20% of the civilian population of North Korea were murdered in the Korean War. This is all on the public record. You can literally go to whitehouse.gov to learn this information. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the President of the United States, said, if China does not capitulate to our demands in regards to the Korean War, we will drop a nuclear bomb on Fujian. At the same time, the Americans begin the process of funneling troops and resources into South Vietnam to begin the process of what becomes known as the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is a 20-year-long war that happened within the borders of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos primarily, although it definitely affects Thailand and Burma as well. Again, 80% of the infrastructure of these countries is reduced to rubble. 20% of the civilian population dies. In a policy that comes out from the Nixon administration at that time of anything that flies against anything that moves. While this is all going on, the Communist Party of China come together and create a policy for what they are to do to defend themselves against these Americans that are destroying countries on their border to, quote, staunch the spread of communism, while simultaneously threatening to drop nuclear bombs on them. And the policy that they came up with was the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was not done because the communists wanted to do it or thought to themselves, hey, hunky-dory, I've got a good idea. It was done out of sheer terror during a period of incredible war against a terrifying foe that was decimating countries on their border from the skies. That, yes, it inflicted a toll on the domestic population, which the Chinese people themselves acknowledge. But militarily, it worked. It allowed the Chinese to send 9,000 guns to Vietnam free of charge. They just gave them to the Vietnamese. China sent 300,000 troops to Vietnam to fight in the Vietnam War. So for the West to turn around and point a finger at how the Chinese dealt with this overwhelming war that the Americans brought to their borders and try to condemn the Chinese for how they responded, I think that that's despicable at the highest possible level. Of course it was difficult. They were defending themselves against a nuclear power that was threatening to drop nuclear bombs on them. Of course there was hardship. Of course it was an intense period of time. Of course tough decisions needed to be made. They were looking at a country that was willing to murder 20%, millions of people in Korea, millions of people in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They did what they had to do. And for capitalists to try to use the Great Leap Forward as a condemnation of communism is evil, demonic. If it wasn't so ruthless, it would actually be pathetically adorable and kind of cute. So that's the Great Leap Forward. And why I think that using the Great Leap Forward as a condemnation of communism is an act of enormous evil that should never be tolerated. Pivoting over to what is known as the Holodomor. Thank you, James. The Holodomor is slightly different. Remembering that this region used to be owned by Thurs, literal feudal monarchs. This region is a famine-stricken region. There is good history under the Thurs of famines occurring. The Holodomor, incidentally, was not localized to Ukraine. There's plenty of evidence to show that it affected Belarus, Lithuania, sections of Russia as well, right? Even going into Romania, right? The communist position is not that a famine did not occur, right? It is certainly the case that a famine occurred. It's this contention of intent, because the claim is that the Soviets intentionally committed a genocide against the Ukrainians. The trouble with this claim is that it doesn't add up. And there's also another trouble with the claim, is that it originates from Nazis. That the Nazis themselves are the ones who begin this claim that the Holodomor was an intentional famine that was done against the Ukrainians. The major issue I have with this claim, that it was an intentional famine done against the Ukrainians, is that there's literally no evidence for it. Genocides can't happen in secret. There's no such thing as a secret genocide. You can't mobilize millions of people and millions of dollars of assets without talking about it. Vladimir Putin opened up the Soviet archives to the West and allowed Westerners in to analyze the Soviet archives. And you know what they found? They found Joseph Stalin and the Soviets recognizing that a famine was upon them, doing everything they possibly could to mitigate the famine, to get ahead of it, to try to prevent the famine from destroying the people of Ukraine the best that they possibly could. And then you find them doing a post-mortem and asking themselves, what did we do to exacerbate this famine? Could we have acted better? Is there a more intelligent way we could have moved forward? And of course, Western forces have taken this post-mortem and used it as a confession letter to pretend as though it's a mismanagement crisis, as if the capitalists would have done any better. Capitalists have a long history of doing vulture capitalism. They would have just risen the price of grain and caskets, of course. There are two key points to point out about the Holodomor, outside of the fact that there is no evidence of intent whatsoever, and actually lots of evidence to show that the Soviets were trying to deal with that crisis as it fell upon them. Number one, there hasn't been a famine in the region since. So this famine-stricken area in Ukraine, it can easily be argued that the Soviets actually experienced one such famine for themselves and then resolved and solved the problem of famines in the region permanently. Number two, and I think that this is like nail in the coffin on the idea of the intentional genocide of the Holodomor. During World War II, the second largest cohort, so the first largest cohort that fought alongside the Soviets were Russians, of course. The second largest cohort, Ukrainians. It's sort of odd that the people who just experienced an intentional famine at the hands of the Russians would join the Russians. It's sort of odd that we don't have any evidence. We don't have a bureaucrat anywhere saying, let's do a famine against the Ukrainians. We don't have an opposition movement in Ukraine. We don't have a Ukrainian bureaucrat saying the Soviets are committing a genocide against us through a famine. We don't have a single scrap of evidence. When Adolf Hitler committed the Holocaust, he wrote about doing it in Mein Kampf, and then they voted on it in their parliament. When America committed the genocide against the First Nations people, they voted on it in their Congress. When Canada erected the residential school system, they voted on it in Parliament. You have to organize a genocide openly. There is no such thing as a secret genocide, simply based on the mechanism and the mechanics and the technicalities of it. You can't holistically plan a genocide. When Netanyahu commits the genocide against the Palestinian people, it's done very much in open. It's done very openly. June, I was in a play about this issue. Yes, they ruled by decree, but they decreed. Like, it was planned. We have the confessions. We have the documents. So, if you want to plant the flag on the idea that the Holodomor was an intentional genocide, then my statement to you is, where are the planning documents? Why is it that the only documents we actually have the Soviets saying we need to alleviate this famine? We need to do something about this crisis. We need to get ahead of this. Send grain. How do we solve this? Why is that the only evidence that we have? Why is there literally no evidence? Oh, for goodness sakes, XD, it's worse than that. I actually have something right here. For the people thinking the problem is only the government of Israel, this is how the people of Israel act around the Israeli finance minister Smotrich, who called for genocide, ethnic cleansing, and parading dead bodies on carts. He literally has a girls' fan club. I'll spare you the audio. Here's this guy walking down the street. Young girls are surrounding him, jumping up and down, taking selfies, laughing, asking for his signature, right? If you ever believe in the concept of the cult of personality, that's what this is. Marquis Saint Laurent, did Lenin really genocide 500,000 people? Hilarious. Like, the Russians fought a revolutionary war against Tsarists. Is that what you're talking about? Like, you should take a look at the history of Nicholas, the last Tsar of Russia. You should take a look at him. You know, the Jewish pogroms, the constant wars of aggression. There's a reason why he was overthrown. Marquis asks, who's this guy? This guy is the Israeli finance minister, Smotrich, who, like all the ministers in Israel, has called for genocide and the ethnic cleansing, as well as the parading of dead bodies on carts. So I hope that answers your question, James. Please understand, the Holodomor has become interwoven into the story that comes out of North America because many of the Ukrainians that fled from World War II were Nazis and Nazi collaborators, and they ended up in Canada and the United States, and they end up in political organizations. This is how we end up here in Canada honoring a Nazi in our parliament. Right? A story that made international headlines just last year. That the Liberal Party had the entire parliament stand up and honor, in front of Zelensky no less, a World War II veteran that fought against the Russians. He was a Nazi. So this is how you end up with legislation being passed in Ontario to teach the Holodomor as if it is fact to children in Ontario. This is how you end up with a human rights museum in Winnipeg, Manitoba that teaches the Holodomor as if it actually happened. No evidence. It's simply a political movement from the ancestors of neo-Nazi. The ancestors of Nazis. In Canada, in the Liberal Party today, the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, is the granddaughter of a Nazi propagandist, Michael Chomiak. He worked under Goebbels. Ukrainian. So the Ukrainian diaspora here in North America is infected with Nazism. Oh, I think I said ancestors. Yes, descendants. Thank you, XD. Yeah, Fiddleford writes, famines were an issue before agricultural industrialization. America had one 8 years prior. Yeah. What I find to be kind of disgraceful about the Holodomor narrative is that natural disasters happen. Like, when natural disasters occur, the position of countries that are rational and sane, so, not neo-Nazis or not Nazis, should be one of sympathy and with a position of sending aid. We don't have control of the planet. Natural disasters occur. And when they occur, we do our best. And we try our hardest. But to turn this natural disaster, to politicize a natural disaster in order to try to drive a wedge between people, I think it's disgraceful. I think it shouldn't be tolerated. So, having answered the questions, let's move on. We only have 15 minutes left in the cast. Hey guys, guess what? From Business Insider, Denver, Colorado, gave people experiencing homelessness $1,000 a month. A year later, nearly half of the participants had housing. Turns out, you guys, that the best way to eliminate homelessness is by eliminating homelessness. Who knew? Jaron Laws lived in his car in a restaurant parking lot near downtown Denver. He worked there as a cook until 2020, making about $400 a month. That was barely enough to cover his car payments and child support, and not even close to what he would need for rent. The 51-year-old occasionally spent part of his paycheck on weekend stays at cheap hotels, where he could spend time with his children. He struggled to afford food, clothes, and medicine, and he had been experiencing homelessness for nearly a decade. That changed when Laws enrolled in the Denver Basic Income Pilot Project. The pilot program allowed Laws to secure a temporary apartment with furniture and spend time with his children and find a better paying job. I had questioned myself if I was going to be a good father to my children because I was suffering, Laws previously told Business Insider. When I got accepted, it changed my life. Denver's Basic Income Pilot, which first started payments in fall 2022, focused on over 800 Coloradans experiencing homelessness, including people living in cars, temporary shelters, the outdoors, or other non-fixed living situations. Participants like Laws were given direct cash payments, no strings attached, and could spend the money on whatever they needed. Denver released the project's one-year report on June 18th, showing that 45% of participants secured their own house or apartment after receiving basic income for 10 months. They also experienced fewer emergency room visits, nights spent in a hospital or a temporary shelter, and jail stays. The report estimates that this reduction in public service use saved the city $589,214. Denver's program initially lasted 1 year and was extended in January for another 6 months. Participants were sorted into random groups. One received $1,000 a month for a year, another got $6,500 up front, followed by $500 a month, and a third got $50 a month as a control group. The City of Denver, the Colorado Trust, and an anonymous foundation funded the project, and it's already provided more than $9.4 million to participants. Basic income programs like Denver have become a popular strategy to reduce poverty in U.S. cities. Compared to traditional social services like SNAP or Medicaid, basic income allows participants to spend the money where they need it most. What is fundamentally different about our approach is the way that we start from a place of trust, Mark Donovan, the project founder and executive director, said in a Tuesday press conference. Denver's report found that basic income primarily helped participants pay for immediate expenses, like transportation, hygiene, clothes, and groceries. Affording recurring bills like rent, healthcare, or debt payments was also a top priority for most families. Participants in each group reported increased financial stability and reduced reliance on emergency financial assistance programs. Basic income puts low-income families on an equal playing field. Nick Pacheco, participant engagement coordinator, said in a press conference. He said the cash payments also help participants get the training and resources they need to establish careers. Individuals who received the lump sum or $1,000 a month payments were more likely to find a stable full-time job than before they received a basic income. It's freedom, Pacheco said. It's freedom from poverty and not being able to reach your goals. Participating households also experienced improved mental health and could spend more time with family and friends. Parents were able to better support their children and grandchildren. These results echo from those 6 months' report, which found fewer participants were sleeping on the street, experiencing food insecurity, and feeling unsafe. This pivots us into another article about the basic income. Basic income from homeless saved taxpayers thousands, study reveals. This is from Newsweek, so of course, it's the money that matters. Fafufa on Twitch writes, how does standing up for... I don't know if I want to state those things, align with my communist views. I don't think I understand your question. I don't think I've ever stood up for rapists, certainly. And, I mean, murderers. Like, defending yourself in a war. Which flag? Is it the Palestinian flag that offends you? Which flag? Let's get specific. No, obviously you are. I just don't think you understand the subject, and I don't think you understand a thing about what you're talking about. So I think there's a lot of projection going on in these comments. Which flag? Very simple question. I understand that you're triggered. I understand that you're offended. I don't think you understand why. No, and I just think you've left. So you're also a coward. Got it. That's pretty standard. Like, what's so foolish about interacting with me in this way is it just entrenches me. That's all. Like, unpersuasive. Yeah. I think we're good. You're breaking rule number 1, which is basic kindness. If you are not intelligent enough to be kind, you are not intelligent enough to discuss things with. So, farewell. Basic manners are required to be involved in, basic discussion with people. So, that's the lesson for today for you. Goodbye. Well, that was exciting. I don't know why I'm in this screen, and I don't know how to get out of this screen. Yeah, I'm just going to do this. Click. I am fine with people who want to disagree with me. That's fine. But if you are showing an unwillingness to understand, like, basic decency, then that's all the evidence I need to show that you're wrong and I'm right. Right? Like, if you don't understand what basic decency is, then you are wrong. And I don't need to move forward with that. Yeah, Ranger Doomer over on Twitch, he didn't even answer which flag. I guess he was just fighting the imaginary foe. I mean, I think that he just didn't want to talk about the Palestinian flag and reveal that he was probably a Nazi, right? That's usually how Nazis operate, right? They can't actually engage you critically. They don't actually know anything. That's why they're Nazis. So they assume that they're just going to impress you with their bravado or their puffed out chest, or that somehow they're going to offend. Like, what he was trying to do is get me to get emotional and rise to the bait. so that he could sit in his room alone and sad and pathetic because he's a Nazi and all his friends are Nazis, and go, heh, 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 because he's just a creepy little troll, right? He doesn't have anything intellectual to say. He doesn't have anything interesting to say. He's just a creepy, weird little Nazi. And so he was probably offended by the Palestinian flag, and he was trying to seek, he was just trying to get a rise out of me. So don't need to keep him around. Very straightforwardly. I have 3 hard rules that I follow that I will ban people for. Ban number 1, basic decency. If you are not intelligent enough to understand basic decency, you are not intelligent to stay. Simply put. And I don't care if you ideologically agree with me. If you are trash talking people in my chat, if you're being indecent to people, you're gone. And no, I won't reconsider that. 2, you're a Nazi, right? If we have a very nice, polite conversation, and then along the way you reveal to me that you're a Nazi, you're gone. No Nazis. You are wrong. It's not a debate. It's not a discussion. I hope something bad happens to you. I hope you go to jail, and that's the best outcome for you. And then number 3, if we are having a discussion and then you stop responding rationally to evidence, and you refuse to acknowledge evidence, and you keep asserting your position while refusing to acknowledge evidence. So no flat earthers, right? No Christian fundamentalists. I'm just not interested in convincing somebody who has decided to not be convinced. So those are my 3 hard lines, and I will always uphold those. Joe writes, Transylvanian actually writes, I want to say this. Out of all your flags, the Canadian one is the only one that could be considered offensive. That is probably true, dude. Like, it's like how like this is a colonial flag, right? I'm gonna rip on the Canadian flag for a minute. Look how dorky this flag is, eh? What a dorky, lame-ass flag made by dorky, lame-ass people. Like, look at this fucking thing. Right? 2 red stripes. 2 fucking red stripes. White. And then just, like, maple leaf. Hey, you know what we got a lot of here? We got a lot of maple leaves. This is just, like, the least offensive flag I've ever seen in my life. Yeah, who puts a leaf on their flag? Right? Literal garbage. Like, and of course red and white are the colors of the British Empire. So, like, it's just, like, got colonialism written all over it. For God's sakes, listen to the national anthem. Oh, Canada, our home and native land. True patriot love. When all of us command, with glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Da 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 da. God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Just, like, eliminate the colonialism, right? Just eliminate it. Joe writes, but alas, God says they are deserving of their low at least status. He put them there. Thus you are tinkering with God's plan. Yeah. Pastor Dickhead of the Prosperity Gospel Alliance. Yeah. Yeah. Home and stolen native land. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's pretty brutal. Yeah, it's pretty brutal. Yeah, we were here first. We definitely were here first. Well, with that, guys, I think I'm going to call it today. Thank you so much, each and every one of you, for being here. It's so beautiful to talk to each and every one of you. Today, I'm going to say a big shout out to James. I think James came in here with, you know what I really admire about James and what I really admire about him. I think he's going to be a good kid. Is that he understood that he didn't know anything about the subject, and he was just asking questions, saying things like, "Hey, I've heard this. I've heard about this kind of thing. What do you think?" He wasn't accusing me of anything. He wasn't denigrating me or calling me names or saying that I was stupid for the beliefs that I had. So big shout out to you, James. If that's how we're going to move forward as people, then I feel pretty good. And of course, right after James came in, we needed to get, the more common experience here at the Canadian Commie. If you would like to donate to this project, please visit patreon.com/the Canadian Commie. Even $1 helps. Thank you to my Patreons. Big shout out to you guys, the people who have been supporting me all this time. If you would like to up your donation, I wouldn't hate it. Thank you so much for being here. Always remember, guys, each and every one of you is a quantum being walking around in quantum energy. These billionaires are spending hundreds of billions of dollars in the hopes you'll never realize it. You'll just stay the good little commodity they need you to be. Rebel. Revolt. Repent. Good luck. We're going to need it.